The Hobbit trilogy earned $3 billion, but made one critical mistake. You see, while the Hobbit films helped Tolkien's story reach the ends of the earth, it alienated the core audience who knew the original story. Because if you didn't know, the book and movies are entirely different. Bilbo goes on a journey with Thorin's company, and that's pretty much where the similarities stop. And after reading and watching both versions of this epic adventure many times, I thought it was officially time for someone to sit down and document what those crucial changes between these two formats actually are. Which characters were removed or added? What plot points got warped or revised to fit the film format? Were the locations accurate, and how did it impact the story? These are just a few of the questions I want to address as I go scene by scene and page by page through the book and movies to find every single change. And in this video, we'll kick things off by covering all the changes regarding the first chapter of the book across 4 major categories: characters, timeline, location, and plot. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and relax as we head into episode 1 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, The Hobbit Edition. As always in this series, we need to begin our analysis by reviewing what the film's version of events were. And because Peter Jackson decided to turn a children's novel into 3 massive movies, that means what we're covering today is 40 minutes long in the movie. That's right, one single chapter was extended to fill 40 full minutes. You might think that means they could have made it accurate because they easily could have fit all the original dialogue and scenes, but you'd be mistaken. No, there are just about 16 different changes to the plot, which we'll cover later. But anyway, without going word for word through these scenes, here's a brief refresher. To start, we see Bilbo, old Bilbo that is, beginning to write in his red book the entire account of his journey. And this includes sharing the fate of Dale and Erebor as Smaug takes over the mountain. We learn about who Thorin is, the finding of the Arkenstone, and the betrayal of the elves. Then there's a fun little cameo from Elijah Wood as Frodo, and then finally the movie goes back in time to when Bilbo was in his 50s, smoking on his bench out front. Gandalf comes up and talks with him, and Bilbo runs inside after the wizard insinuates that he's signed him up for an adventure. Then after a brief extended edition scene of Bilbo going to a market, paranoid about Gandalf, we cut to nighttime as he prepares his supper. Dwarves begin to show up one by one, with Gandalf eventually arriving as well. And then we get the rowdy dinner scene and the iconic cleaning song. Finally, Thorin arrives, and the dwarves get down to business, ending with Bilbo passing out as he gets lumped into this adventure as their burglar. He completely refuses to participate though, and the dwarves somberly sing a song about their homeland and then go to bed. And that's where this 40-minute section ends, and our analysis begins. Obviously, I skipped over a lot of detail, but we'll get to those crucial elements during the changes. And speaking of which, let's begin by looking at our first 3 categories, which are usually smaller, and those are characters, timeline, and locations. Thankfully this week, location gets a pass as everything occurs within Bag End or the Shire itself. Then for timeline, there's only one notable difference, and that is simply that the dwarves actually arrive at tea time and stay all evening. They speak for hours and hours after playing music and go to bed late. The movie switches around the order of these events, but more specifically, the dwarves don't arrive until the evening in the movie. This, thankfully, is a simple change, but we didn't get so lucky for our characters category. Regarding characters, there are multiple crucial changes that will ripple out and impact the rest of this film trilogy. So it's key to note them down here at the beginning of this series. First, we need to communicate the massive difference in the dwarves' ages. I won't go through all 13, but a good reference point and perhaps the most impactful change is Thorin's age. Before I reveal his age, go ahead and in the comments let me know how old you think he is based on the movie. Are you ready? Well, I can almost guarantee that you are wrong if you had no prior knowledge of his age, because in the book, he is 195 years old. Something that's never really communicated in the films is that the dwarves live for a few hundred years typically, and the events of Erebor happened a long time ago. Now technically in the movie, there is a point at which Thorin says the dragon Smaug has not been seen for 60 years. So this could explain away this timeline issue. But it doesn't explain why Thorin looks like a GQ model at the ripe age of 195. Which could be a character change in and of itself, I guess, as we all know that the dwarves, some of them at least, don't really look like dwarves. But I'm sure we'll get into that in a future episode. Anyway, moving on to the other character changes, we have a few incorrect additions, some of which massively impact the future of this story. First, on a smaller note, Dane, the Lord of the Iron Hills, isn't actually mentioned until much later in the book. And Frodo isn't included either, despite being shown as a cameo in this trilogy. But as for the big changes, we have 3 key characters who contribute to the film's plot in major ways: Azog the Defiler, the Necromancer, and Thranduil. Here's the interesting thing. Azog is dead during the events of this book in Tolkien's lore. In fact, Dane from the Iron Hills beheaded him many years prior. As for the Necromancer, that spawns a whole subplot in the movie that never exists in the book. Gandalf had already found Thrain captive by the time the events of The Hobbit took place, not at the same time like the movies will show. Again, that's something that I'm sure we'll get into much later in this series. And lastly, Thranduil is never named in the entire Hobbit book. That's right, Tolkien simply refers to him as the Elven King. He isn't given a name until the Lord of the Rings books. So, as you can see, we're set up for quite the time as we analyze these 3 films, because right off the bat, we have 3 of the most prominent characters not participating in the way the movie shows, or just not existing in the story of The Hobbit whatsoever. Fun, right? Well, if you like that, then you'll love the next section as we dive into all of the plot changes. To begin our analysis of every change to the story itself, we of course need to take a look at The Hobbit's opening scene, which showcases a flashback of Dale and Erebor. Obviously, this exact flashback isn't present at the beginning of the book, but that's not what I consider the first change, because technically we do learn about the events of Smaug's attack later in this chapter, with more details trickling in throughout the entire book. But buried inside this memory are multiple errors that I cannot overlook. First, the backstory of Thranduil's relationship with the dwarves seems to be fabricated for this trilogy. Like I mentioned earlier, Thranduil himself is only referred to as the Elven King in the book, and we don't really get a backstory for him. The movie embellishes on Thranduil's connection to the jewels under the mountain, and as far as I'm aware, the whole sub-story of those being his wife's jewels doesn't show up anywhere in Tolkien's text. Now, I could be wrong, I was searching around for a while for this, so please let me know if you know where Thranduil's wife comes up in Tolkien's lore regarding Erebor and the dwarves specifically. So drop that in the comments if you know. Additionally, the next change is that Thranduil's army is nowhere near the mountain on the day of Smaug's attack. I didn't include this as a timeline or location change, but it kind of is both, because it makes no sense that Thranduil just happened to be there with thousands of elves on the exact day that Smaug attacked. It was a multiple-day journey between their kingdoms, but the movie makes it seem like it all happened in one day. After all, it's as Thorin is running out of the mountain that he looks up and sees the Elven King. And speaking of Thorin, that brings us to the final error with this flashback, because we learn from Thorin himself in the book that he wasn't in the mountain on the day of the attack, which explains his survival. He says that in his younger years, he was adventurous and he, along with some other dwarves, were out exploring in the woods on that day, and they saw the dragon land on top of the mountain and send everything up in flames. So no, he was not there, and therefore this entire sequence, including him, is made up. Now, moving on past this flashback, the next thing we see in the movie is a brief cameo from Elijah Wood as Frodo, and it helps connect this moment to the beginning of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's a fun scene, and I personally like the connection, but as you might have guessed, the book doesn't include this at all. The first chapter starts much simpler by describing hobbits and hobbit holes, and then giving a brief history of the Bagginses themselves, and more importantly, a history of Belladonna Took, Bilbo's mother, and his connection to a more adventurous spirit. But now that the preamble is over with, the real story begins, as the movie finally gets to young Bilbo sitting and smoking in front of Bag End. And I should say younger Bilbo because he is still about 50 years old, but he's not 111. Anyway, a small change but impactful to understanding Bilbo himself is the fact that in the book, he is way more welcoming and jovial upon Gandalf's approach. When he says good morning, he actually means it. And we read that it was indeed a very nice day and Bilbo was in good spirits. In fact, Bilbo eventually even invites Gandalf to sit and smoke with him, offering to share his own pipeweed. Although he is wary of the traveler, Book Bilbo still has the heart of a hobbit, which is welcoming and hospitable to most strangers. And we'll see more of this as the dwarves start arriving the next day. In addition to Bilbo's invite to smoke, the movie leaves out another crucial invite he extends to Gandalf to join him for tea the following day. He very clearly turns down the invite to adventure, but in an awkward attempt to end the conversation, he blurts out that Gandalf is welcome to tea the following day, and then he hurriedly goes inside Bag End to escape the conversation. Even a hobbit's hospitality can grow thin, and especially after the mention of an adventure. But this invite gives us more context for the following day when the doorbell rings and Bilbo believes it to be Gandalf, because it rings right at tea time. But before we get to the dwarves' arrival, we have another change regarding an extended edition scene, which shows Bilbo going to the market and getting a fish for his dinner. He is paranoid about potentially seeing Gandalf and even asks another hobbit if they've seen the wizard. This is a funny little extended edition scene, but A, it doesn't happen in the book, and B, it wouldn't happen anyway because we read that the next day Bilbo had forgotten about Gandalf entirely. In fact, he didn't remember the wizard or the invite he gave him to tea until his bell rang right at tea time. And on that note, we can move into the arrival of our 13 dwarves. Something I want you to focus on as we go throughout these changes is Bilbo's personality and attitude about everything that happens to him. We've already seen a slight difference in his demeanor as he interacted with Gandalf and even invited him to smoke and to tea, but these next few changes regarding the dwarves' dinner will show just how different our book Bilbo is from the movie. And the first example of this comes when the dwarves begin to eat. In the movie, it is much more the dwarves getting food, with Bilbo running around yelling at them the whole time. But in the book, it's quite the opposite. In fact, as each dwarf arrives, Bilbo takes their orders for food and drink and continues to bring them stuff, even cooking for them. We even read one part during the chaos in which Bilbo thinks to himself that he knows his role as the host, and he will feed the entire company of dwarves even if it means he has to go without eating himself, which one, that's huge for a hobbit, and two, that's crazy considering he didn't even know he was going to be supplying dinner that night. This is a true representation of hobbit hospitality, and it doesn't reflect the same on screen. Movie Bilbo is reluctant to even give up one single meal to Dwalin. Let alone when the rest of the dwarves show up, he is running around telling them to put things back and to stop what they're doing. Now, I actually really enjoy Martin Freeman in these movies, and he's great during this scene. And this video isn't about my opinion of the films in general. I'm merely here as an unbiased researcher, so you can draw conclusions for yourself. But what I will say is that this completely flips Bilbo around from what he is supposed to be, and we aren't finished yet. The next change is a quick one, and that is that Thorin doesn't show up by himself later after the meal. He arrives with Gandalf and 3 other dwarves, and he actually falls through the door like they show some of the other dwarves doing in the movie. We read that after this he was grumpy with Bilbo for opening the door so abruptly, but mainly because Bombur fell on top of him, and as we all know, Bombur is gravitationally challenged. Now, before I move into the last few changes regarding their discussion of the actual adventure, I wanted to point out something that isn't a change, but I think needs to be mentioned, and that is the cleaning song of That's What Bilbo Baggins Hates. Although not all the words are identical, this song is indeed in the book, and it happens pretty much just like the movie shows. Bilbo is so swept up by their singing and moving around that he suddenly sees all the plates and things neatly stacked up without knowing what really happened. And it's key to remember that this book is written from Bilbo's perspective, so it makes sense that in typical Bilbo fashion, he would embellish things for the sake of the story. So while we may watch the scene and think poorly of it because compared to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, it seems too fanciful or unrealistic, it actually makes perfect sense when you read the book. It is a children's book after all, so to have dwarves tossing dishes around without breaking a single one while somehow all singing the same song in unison is accurate to what Tolkien wrote. So again, this isn't a change, but worth pointing out, as we'll have more moments like this throughout the trilogy, in which our brains will want to assume that the movie made an error, but in actuality, it is what Tolkien wrote. Now that being said, let's move on to the events after dinner, and take a look at the dwarves singing. But wait, you say, that's not until after they discuss the adventure. Well, that's the change, you see. In the book, they sing before they talk business, because Thorin says it's best to discuss dark business in the dark, and it's still a little too light out for the liking of the dwarves. So they pass the time by playing music and singing. That's right, playing music. They each fetch instruments they brought, and maybe most surprising of all, Thorin plays a golden harp. I know, manly GQ model Thorin is master of the harp. It's great. Now, this music they play actually is key to the next change, which is all about Bilbo's attitude. Like I said, we have several instances today of Bilbo's character being changed, and this is yet another one. As the dwarves played their instruments and sang, Bilbo felt the tookish part of him wake up and desire to go adventure. It's a moment which we never see in the movie, as movie Bilbo is consistently against the idea of being their burglar. And although in the book they haven't gotten that far in the conversation yet, Bilbo is already feeling brave and up for the journey. However, this does fluctuate as near the end of the song, he starts to imagine the horrible parts of the adventure, like dying, and he gets scared again. But the Tookish part of him doesn't fully die yet, as we'll soon see. The next change is that Bilbo doesn't pass out while reading a contract. He actually starts having a fit after Thorin begins the meeting and mentions that some of them may never return. This proves to be too much for the poor Hobbit, and after realizing the severity of this meeting, Bilbo has a panic attack and they have to remove him to a different room. But the next change brings us back to Bilbo's Tookish nature, as he recovers from his fit and overhears the dwarves planning in the other room. Quite some time has passed, and he happened to overhear Gloin talking about him, saying that he's not a burglar and would be no good on the adventure. This set Bilbo off. He could put up with a lot, but he would not sit by while someone in his own home said that he was no good. So he got up, stormed into the other room, and did the unthinkable. He told them that no matter what they asked, he would do it. That's right, completely opposite to movie Bilbo, who declines Gandalf's pleas after he wakes up from fainting. In fact, in the movie, when the dwarves say that he's no burglar, Bilbo agrees, as he is very intent on not being involved. Now again, I actually enjoy movie Bilbo, but it is odd when comparing him to the book, because even in this first chapter, you begin to see the major differences in their personalities. And I wonder if that'll keep up throughout the rest of the story, or if things will balance out once the adventure begins. Now to finish up, we have 3 more changes. First, after Gandalf reveals the map, Thorin seems not so surprised by a side entrance, but more so worried that Smaug would have found this secret passage already. But Gandalf tells him that Smaug wouldn't be able to fit, as it would be quite a small door. Thorin then turns and asks Bilbo for his suggestions, almost testing him as a burglar, and Bilbo asks for more details. So Thorin gives him the story of Smaug's attack and mentions that sometime after the attack, Thror and Thrain were found in the woods, and Thorin always wondered how they got out. But now the secret passage explains things. This explanation of the story is where most of the prologue scene is pulled from, but like we discussed earlier in this video, there are quite a few differences. The second to last change is that another key part of the conversation was removed regarding how Gandalf obtained the map. Thorin is curious and presses him on this because he's almost accusatory of how the wizard came to possess a map that rightfully belongs to Thorin. Gandalf explains that he got it from Thrain, who he found in the captivity of the necromancer. Thrain's mind had already gone, and Gandalf didn't even learn Thorin's name, so it took him a while to find the dwarf so he could give him the map. This part of the book also further reinforces just how long it has been, as Gandalf says that Thorin hasn't seen his father for 100 years. And finally, the last difference between the movie and the first chapter of the book is that the movie omitted the final part of the night as they head to bed and Bilbo took each of the dwarves' breakfast orders. By this point though, many hours had passed, and Bilbo's tookishness had worn off. He decided in his own mind that he wouldn't bother getting up and fixing them all breakfast, and he was quite certain that he wouldn't be going on any adventure the next day. And that is where the chapter ends. But of course, we know that's not quite how things will end up. And that wraps up every difference between the book and movie for episode 1 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the Hobbit edition. Picking up with where we left off last week, we see Bilbo waking up the morning after his unexpected dinner party and seeing his home completely empty. Not only empty, but clean. It almost seems like the previous night was a bad dream until he spots the contract that Thorin had given him. The movie then cuts as he sprints through the Shire and eventually catches up to Gandalf and the dwarves, and then they officially set off on their adventure. We see a traveling montage which includes beautiful sights and a moment of the company camping out as Balin shares the story of Thorin and how he defeated the Pale Orc in a battle to reclaim the ancient kingdom of Moria. Then the movie cuts to another day as it's raining on the company, which then helps the movie transition to a new character in the story, Radagast. We see the brown wizard bustling about as he tries to save one of the animals in his area from a dark magic or a poison of some sort. Afterwards, he follows some spiders as they head to wherever they came from, and he sees Dol Guldur. But before the fun starts there, the movie cuts back to the dwarves who have found a spot to camp. Gandalf leaves them after getting into an argument with a very stubborn Thorin, and as the night progresses, we learn that Fili and Kili have lost some of their ponies. Bilbo and the 2 young dwarves then investigate further and see a troll carrying off 2 more of their ponies. So Fili and Kili task Bilbo with going to free the ponies and to investigate the trolls. You're probably familiar with what happens next, as it's one of the most iconic parts of the Hobbit book and movies. Bilbo goes up and gets caught by the trolls, and then the dwarves get caught as well in an attempt to attack the three beasts. Ultimately, Bilbo stalls the trolls by telling them different ways of cooking the dwarves, while Gandalf comes up from behind, breaks a massive rock, and reveals the sun, which turns the trolls to stone. After the dwarves and Bilbo are all freed, they find the trolls' hideout in a cave. Some of the dwarves bury some treasure, while Gandalf and Thorin find some nice elvish blades. Gandalf even finds a small blade for Bilbo, which we know as Sting. And that is where our scenes cut off for this week's episode. So let's not waste any more time and jump right into things by heading into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. This week, these three categories are pretty simple. As for characters, we only have a couple of issues. First, Radagast isn't present in the Hobbit book. He is mentioned, but as you know if you watched episode 1 of the series, the whole necromancer subplot is made up. So this scene we see in the film appears nowhere in the book. Besides that, the only other character issue we have is the fact that Dain and his father Nain are not really present in the battle to reclaim Moria. In the true version of the story, which I'll elaborate on in the plot changes, Dain and Nain are kind of the main characters of that fight, not Thorin. Anyway, next we would typically have timeline, but that actually gets a pass this week. So, moving on to location, we have one missing place of note, which is the Green Dragon. Yep, that's the same Green Dragon in the Shire, which we know and love from The Lord of the Rings. But we'll see how that location is involved as we get into the first couple of plot changes. Starting with Bilbo waking up alone in his home, we have an immediate difference, which is the fact that in the book, his house is a mess. The dwarves did indeed have the breakfast they discussed the night before, and this time did not sing a fun song while cleaning up. Nope, they left the mess for Bilbo, reminding him of the crazy night he had just had with them. And that brings us to the second change, which is kind of a big one, and that is that Bilbo doesn't run off after the dwarves. He actually just makes breakfast, determined to move on with his life. He does have a brief moment of FOMO, but quickly stuffs it down as he reminds himself that he is not cut out for adventures. So what does get him to leave his cozy hobbit hole? Well, in the book, Gandalf actually comes back for him. As Bilbo eats breakfast, Gandalf storms in and asks what he's doing. He then shows Bilbo a letter from Thorin which was set on the mantelpiece, and it states that Bilbo is accepted as the 14th member of the company and to meet them at the Green Dragon where they'll wait for him until 11 a.m. Bilbo tried to put up a fight, but Gandalf wouldn't let him get a word in and essentially forced him out the door. And considering that 11 a.m. was only about 10 minutes away, Bilbo ran as fast as he could to get to the Green Dragon in time. And with that, the adventure could begin. Now, because of this massive change to the narrative, there are two smaller points that are affected. First, there is no contract, but rather the letter from Thorin is the agreement, outlining Bilbo's share of the loot and so forth. No big, long, multi-page document like the movie shows. And second, there is no bet on whether or not Bilbo would show up. Which brings us to another change, as you might have noticed one missing character here. After all, Gandalf went to get Bilbo, but he didn't run with him to the dwarves. So where is Gandalf? Well, in the book, Gandalf meets up with the company after they had already set out. Atop a great white horse, Gandalf had brought Bilbo some of his things from home, including a few of his handkerchiefs and his pipe and tobacco. And now that the adventure has begun and our company plus Gandalf are moving throughout the lands, we come upon the first of many massive changes we'll encounter throughout this entire series. After a brief traveling montage, we see Thorin's company camping out and listening to the sound of orcs in the distance. Then Balin shares how Thorin got his name, which is one of his largest character-defining moments. Well, sadly for movie Thorin, this never happened. You see, the story of the dwarves' fight for Moria is much different in Tolkien's lore. Thror, Thorin's grandfather, was not killed in the battle shown in the movie. He and one other dwarf went to investigate Moria by themselves after Smaug took Erebor. This proved to be a very dumb decision, as Azog, who had claimed Moria as his own, killed Thror. He beheaded the dwarf king and carved his name into his forehead, then tossed it to Nar, the dwarf who had went with Thror. Azog also tossed Nar a small pouch full of coins as a mock payment for the king's death. Then, as the orcs continued to desecrate Thror's body, Nar went back to his people, and the 7 dwarf houses united to begin a war against Azog and the orcs. This war took 3 years to plan and culminated in the battle that we see in this scene of the movie, known as the Battle of Zan-Ubazar. By the way, I'm definitely saying that wrong. Anyway, Thorin was most likely present for this battle, but was not the main character. One point that the movie got right was that Azog wanted to wipe out Durin's folk, and he succeeded in killing Nain, Dain Ironfoot's father. Dain then fought Azog, defeated him, and beheaded him. which by the way definitively proves Azog is dead, unlike the Hobbit trilogy which leaves his death ambiguous. Anyway, that being said, I totally see why they changed this for the movie, because Dane is not the main character here. Thorin needed something for us viewers to latch onto, plus with them keeping Azog alive, this made a lot more sense. But at the end of the day, it's still very different from the original. But there's a lot more to cover, so let's move past this scene and move into our next change, which can be a pretty easy one because it brings us to Radagast, who as we know isn't in the book in the same capacity. So this whole scene of him saving a hedgehog and chasing spiders to Dol Guldur never happened. But you know what did happen? Their encounter with trolls. So let's dive into the most important part of today's scenes and figure out exactly what Bilbo did or didn't do, and how Peter Jackson may or may not have made him out to be more of a hero than he really was. Our first change with this sequence is that in the book, Gandalf is missing by the time they find a spot to camp. Plus, it is raining when this happens. The movie kind of moved around this raining moment to earlier in the journey, but in actuality, it happens here. That's not the focus of this change though. The fact that Gandalf isn't there is the bigger difference, because that means that his conversation with Thorin never happens. Gandalf isn't there to see a destroyed farm home. He doesn't tell them to move on. He doesn't argue with Thorin about getting help from the elves. That is all made up. Next, their discovery of the trolls is vastly different. In the book, we read about them losing a great deal of their provisions as one of the ponies got spooked and ran into the river. Fili and Kili got the pony out, but the packs on the pony got taken by the stream. So the dwarves were hangry, cold, and wet from the rain. And in the distance, Balin spots a light. The dwarves then gather around and they all start arguing with each other about how to proceed. Eventually, they decide that their resident burglar should go investigate. So I'll count this all wrapped up as one change, but really, no, they don't see a troll carry off ponies. And no, Fili and Kili don't keep this a secret, but rather all the dwarves see a light in the distance. Next, after Bilbo sneaks up and recognizes the creatures as trolls, he decides to pick the pockets of one of them. He isn't trying to grab a knife to free any ponies because, like I just said, the trolls never took their ponies. The trolls have sheep. But wanting to do something and not come back empty-handed, Bilbo attempts to pick the pocket of William, one of the trolls, and gets caught. By the way, there's a part here where it seems like the purse Bilbo snatches actually speaks. But I don't know if I was just reading that wrong. So if you're familiar with this part of the book, let me know in the comments what you think. Anyway, the next change is the beginning of our Bilbo anti-hero arc, as Book Bilbo accidentally lets it slip that there are others out there with him. In the movie, he does the right thing and tells the trolls that he is alone. But Book Bilbo speaks before he thinks and says yes in response to their question about if there are other Burr-Hobbits out there. He then quickly says no, confusing the trolls on how it can be yes and no. Another change to this moment, which is quite a unique one, is that William, the troll who caught Bilbo, actually suggests letting him go. The trolls realize that he's way too tiny to eat, and William almost seems to pity Bilbo and the way he's squirming around. Unfortunately, the other two trolls are now on alert because of Bilbo saying that there are others like him in the woods. So they refuse to let William let him go. But trolls being trolls, they get into a fight and drop Bilbo. Bilbo has just enough wits to scramble up and hide in the trees after this. But unfortunately, right as the trolls are arguing and fighting, Balin comes into the clearing to see what the commotion is. The trolls shriek when they see him because all trolls hate dwarves, and they quickly throw a sack over Balin's head and then hide in the woods. And this is our next change, because in the movie, we see the dwarves come out all at once and start fighting the trolls in an attempt to save Bilbo. But in the book, the dwarves do maybe the worst possible thing, and one by one come into the clearing. The trolls, who have more brains than you think, simply waited in hiding for each dwarf to come and then they would jump out and bag them. Thorin was the last one to come out, and he at least put up a fight, getting a good couple hits in before being captured. But you know who isn't captured? Bilbo. That's right, unlike the film, Bilbo had gotten away and was hiding in a nearby bush. And therefore, he had the perfect opportunity to do something about this sticky situation. Except he didn't, which is our next change. As Bilbo doesn't save the day, Gandalf does. And the way in which Gandalf saves the day is honestly pretty entertaining. In the book, we read that Bilbo was listening to the trolls' conversation about how to eat the dwarves when suddenly William the troll said it would be no good to roast the dwarves because it would take all night. But when the other trolls told him to stop arguing, William said that he didn't say anything. Then one of the other trolls would say something and later deny that he said anything. This repeats over and over, confusing the trolls and making them argue with one another until Gandalf's voice rang out above theirs and said, "Dawn take you all and be stone to you." And with that, the light of the sun crested the hill and turned the trolls to stone. It wasn't until just then that Bilbo realized what had happened. Gandalf had been impersonating the voices of the trolls and causing arguments to stall for time. Bilbo, meanwhile, had stayed put in his bush with his clothes and skin torn and done nothing, which honestly is expected. It's not like he's done a bunch of these adventures. He's not a veteran in these kinds of affairs, and it's probably the first time that he's ever seen a troll or even gotten scraped up this much. But of course, in an attempt to keep him the center of attention in the movie, Bilbo is the one who stalls the trolls and saves the day. And honestly, I really like the movie version, but let me know in the comments which version you prefer. Anyway, we aren't done just yet, as there are still a handful of other changes regarding the final moments of this chapter. First, the troll cave in the book suggests that these creatures are a bit more civilized than the movie shows. It even has a door with a lock, plus edible food and some ale, which the dwarves take to replenish the stock that they had lost to the river. Also, Bilbo in the book slightly redeems himself by revealing that he had stolen one thing from the trolls, and that was a key, which just so happened to be the key they needed to unlock the trolls' door. So I guess Bilbo in the book did something good here after all. Next, they don't bury treasure in the cave like the movie shows, but they actually take it outside of it and bury it along the path. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting thing about this buried treasure is that they put spells over the top of their deposit to ward off thieves. This is almost a side comment by Tolkien, and not at all the focus, but I do like the idea that dwarves have more magic about them than they get credit for in the movie. Next, another offhand comment from Tolkien is when Bilbo gets sting. It's not a whole moment in which Gandalf finds the blade and then gives it to Bilbo along with a wise quote like the movie shows. It's literally just, oh yeah, we found some swords, one of which is a good size for Bilbo, and that's it. But again, I gotta say I prefer the movie version, especially with the context that the Lord of the Rings viewers know this blade. So it's kind of nice to focus on it for a minute to pay homage to the origin of this iconic weapon. Moving on to our second to last change, the movie removed the details of why Gandalf came back. Although the quotes from the movie are pulled from the book, there's a bit more description of Gandalf's side journey. In the book, he tells Thorin that he was going further ahead to scout their road when he ran into two of Elrond's folk. The elves then informed him of 3 trolls who had come down from the mountain, and Gandalf immediately turned back to head towards the company. I like this context in the book, and more importantly, Thorin doesn't throw a fit when Gandalf mentions Elrond's folk. And now finally, our last change this week is kind of a sneak peek into the next episode, because our scene cuts off abruptly right here with them hearing something approaching in the woods. We'll learn in the next episode that this is Radagast, so I won't get into that right now, but what I will say is that there was no immediate danger in the book. In fact, after pilfering through the troll's cave, they slept until the afternoon to make up for the sleep they lost that night. There's no orc pack nipping at their heels like the movie shows. But again, that's a problem for episode 3 of this series. Picking up from where we left off in last episode, with Thorin's company looting the troll cave, we see Radagast pull up on everybody and inform Gandalf of his visit to Dol Guldur. Right at that moment, wargs enter the scene and start attacking, forcing the dwarves to make a run for it. Thankfully, Radagast is there to save the day and uses his rabbit sled to lead the orcs off in a different direction while Gandalf leads the dwarves and Bilbo to a secret path. This path through the rocks takes them to Rivendell, and they meet Elrond, who is returning from hunting the very orc pack that was chasing them. We then see them having dinner all together, and Elrond takes a look at their swords, identifying Glamdring and Orcrist. Plus, later that night, he looks at their map and reads the moon runes for them. Then, after a bit of conversation between Gandalf and Elrond, we see a meeting of the White Council, which includes Galadriel and Saruman. Saruman is adamant that the necromancer in Dol Guldur is nothing to be concerned about. Plus, he says that Thorin must not be allowed to continue his quest to Erebor. But Galadriel reads Gandalf's mind and realizes that he is stalling so that the dwarves and Bilbo can leave Rivendell without them realizing. The movie then cuts to exactly that as Bilbo gazes back at the homely house of Rivendell before continuing on with the dwarves. And finally, our scenes this week wrap up with Galadriel and Gandalf speaking alone as she tells him that she will always be there for him whenever he needs her. Now, I need to put a huge asterisk on this movie recap, because you might have noticed that I didn't cover any of the extended scenes this week. Well, unlike the previous 2 episodes, this week I am not even going to bother covering them, because the extended scenes here add absolutely nothing to the movie, at least in regards to the book. Everything that is additional here is completely made up, so it's not really worth covering in our changes this week. In future episodes, I'll only include the extended edition if they actually add something of value, but for this week, they get a pass. Now that being said, let's get things started by taking a look at our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First up for characters, we have quite a few movie additions. Lindir the elf is a real elf in Tolkien's works as he shows up in the Hall of Fire in The Lord of the Rings. However, he was really only added here to the film as a way for Figwit to make another appearance. Anyway, besides him, we of course have the additions of Radagast, Azog, Galadriel, Saruman, and the Necromancer. Just like Lindir, these are real characters, but they just don't make an appearance here in The Hobbit. Next, I will cover locations because I want to save timeline for last. Our location category is pretty easy this week. Simply put, the evil fortress of Dol Guldur is a movie-only edition, and so is the secret tunnel to Rivendell that Gandalf takes Thorin's company through. And that's it. Now before we get into the plot changes, let's talk about timeline. And like I said, I saved this for last out of our first three categories because it's probably the most complicated. In the last episode, quite a few people rightly pointed out that I brushed aside the Dol Guldur subplot, because although it doesn't really happen in the way that the movie shows, the White Council's discussions about and attack on the Old Fortress do happen in Tolkien's lore, just on a completely different timeline. Thorin's quest for Erebor happened in Third Age 2941, and at the end of the Hobbit book, we do learn from Gandalf that when he disappeared, he had gone to the fortress, and the council had successfully scared off Sauron. But the idea that the discovery of the Necromancer, the meeting of the Wise, and the attack which caused Sauron to flee all happened within the same year is insane. In fact, in Tolkien's original version, this is spread over hundreds of years. So here is a very brief summary of the true timeline. And by the way, I am planning on making a full video about the entire history of Dol Guldur soon, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, around the year 1100 of the Third Age, the Council of the Wise, also known as the White Council, found out that an evil power had made its home in Dol Guldur. Fearing that this power might be Sauron himself, Gandalf went to investigate in the year 2063, nearly 1,000 years later, and the Necromancer, not powerful enough yet, fled. 400 years later, in 2460, around the same time Smeagol found the One Ring, the Necromancer returned. Fast forward another few hundred years, and in 2845, Thrain II, Thorin's father, was captured on his way to the Lonely Mountain. He had inherited one of the 7 dwarven rings of power from Thror, and Sauron took it from him in Dol Guldur. 5 years later, in 2850, Gandalf again visited the fortress and found Thrain dying in captivity. He had gone insane and didn't even tell Gandalf his own name or that of his son Thorin. But he did give Gandalf a map and a key. During this visit, Gandalf also confirmed that the Necromancer was indeed Sauron. But a year later, despite Gandalf's warning, Saruman overruled an attack on the fortress, because in secret, he had begun searching for the One Ring. Finally, in 2941, Saruman couldn't hold it off any longer and agreed to an attack on Dol Guldur, which happened at the same time as Thorin's quest for Erebor, and is what caused Gandalf to leave them for a time. This attack was successful and forced Sauron to flee once again, and that is the true timeline of this dark fortress. It did not all happen within a year as the movie suggests, and again, I think I'll do a full history breakdown in more detail in a separate video. First, our scene opens up with Radagast arriving and delivering the news of Dol Guldur to Gandalf, and the obvious change here, as you can tell by the character and timeline categories, is that this never happens in the book. Instead, we read that after their troll fiasco, they went on traveling for multiple days, and although things seemed to get darker and become more spooky, they never saw Radagast or heard of this evil fortress. Plus, the next change is that they never even got attacked by orcs. Although they'll have many dangerous encounters to come, this one was fabricated for the film. And that brings us to our third change, which is all about their path to Rivendell. As we discussed in the location category, the secret tunnel that they take in the movie isn't real. What really happens in the book is that they followed a long path to find the valley where Rivendell is located, and this path was marked by white stones which were hard to find. Gandalf seemed to know his way around, but it was slow going as he bobbed around searching for the stones one by one. Finally, after much traveling, they came to the valley, and peered out over a slope to see the beauty below. Although it's not like the movie where Rivendell is just there in the open. The last homely house is still hidden and hard to find, but they at least made it to the right valley. They then zigzagged their way down the slope to get to the land below, and eventually heard the singing of elves. Which brings us to our next change, as we have been falsely led to believe that the singing of elves sounds like a children's choir. No, The Hobbit has a much different tone, one of joy and merriment. The singing of the elves is frankly jolly. I am definitely not going to sing anything for you right now, but I'd encourage you to do a quick Google search and look up the elf song in this chapter, because it's so drastically different from what we get in any of Peter Jackson's films. Additionally, this tone difference goes beyond just singing because it also reveals the lighthearted nature of the dwarves and elves' relationship. They definitely aren't friends, but they aren't enemies, nor do dwarves hate elves. Tolkien writes this regarding their relationship: dwarves don't get on well with them. Even decent enough dwarves like Thorin and his friends think them foolish or get annoyed with them. For some elves tease them and laugh at them, and most of all at their beards. And this is true because on the next page after the elves have helped them get to Rivendell, they make fun of the dwarves' beards and call Bilbo fat. So they make fun of everyone evenly, not just the dwarves. But at the end of the day, it's all in good fun. As you can see, it's not so much a "you betrayed me and therefore my children's grandchildren will despise you," as much as it is a schoolyard-type rivalry. Now, just to be clear, the prejudice between dwarves and elves is definitely there, and this entire story is written from Bilbo's voice and perspective, meaning that we'll have a Bilbo-esque twist on any given narrative. However, it still is incorrect for the movie to switch the tone of this entire journey to Rivendell to hatred or anger. In fact, as we'll see later, Thorin is perfectly courteous and kind to Elrond. Moving on, the next change is one that we've kind of already covered, but must be included as well in the plot section, and that is the fact that the White Council does not meet during this chapter. You already got the full timeline, so I won't repeat it here, but another thing I wanted to point out is that if the Council had met, we would have also seen Círdan the shipwright, but somehow Círdan always gets left out. Anyway, moving on to the map reading scene, this is inspired from the book. Like I said earlier, they are in Rivendell for 2 weeks, and the dinner in which Elrond looks at their swords, plus their time reading the map, doesn't actually happen until the very last night before they depart. But that's not the change. The change is regarding the moon runes on the map. Although a simple difference, it must be said that they don't need a massive crystal on a cliff behind a waterfall in order to read them. It's a lot more boring than that, as Tolkien writes that Elrond simply held up the paper to the sky so that the moonlight could shine through it. And that's it. Also, this isn't much of a change, but I just wanted to mention that Tolkien says moon runes were invented by dwarves, so why didn't anyone in Thorin's company recognize them? Anyway, that's besides the point. Also, I want to point out a change here that I actually didn't even write down in my script, but I want to mention, and that is that elves aren't just strictly vegan or vegetarian. The movie makes a point to make it seem like the dwarves hate all the food in Rivendell, but Bilbo makes it clear that during their 2-week stay, they were very well fed and had a great time. So I just wanted to make that clear. Another change regarding the map reading is that Thorin in the book is almost shocked to learn that the secret runes have to do with Durin. And he says that Durin's day can't be predicted by them because they lack the skill to guess when it'll happen. It's almost like a solar eclipse, and they don't really know when the next one will be. And finally, the last change for these scenes comes at the very end of the chapter, as Tolkien writes that the next day, which was Midsummer's Morning, they all set out on their ponies to continue their quest. Elrond didn't try to stop them, Gandalf went with them, and they still had their ponies. So pretty much the movie got every part of this wrong. But other than that, there's not much more to say. Unfortunately, Bilbo doesn't share the fun details of his stay in Rivendell, and he writes, "I wish I had time to tell you even a few of the tales or 1 or 2 of the songs that they heard in that house. So we'll have to leave it up to the imagination." I think Peter Jackson and co. tried to fill in these gaps during the extended scenes, but if you've seen the extended edition, then you know that none of those scenes are even possibilities. Picking up from where we left off last week, we see a traveling montage as the dwarves trek across Middle-earth, and eventually we see them on the side of a mountain during a thunderstorm. We learn that this is a thunder battle, and we see stone giants hurling rocks at one another as the dwarves and Bilbo nearly die multiple times. Luckily, after Bilbo gets saved by Thorin, they happen to find a cave in the mountain where they can rest. So, with Beaufort taking the first watch, they all go to sleep. Bilbo tries to sneak off and head back to Rivendell, but Beaufort stops him for a minute to talk. Right when Bilbo is about to set out again though, the floor of the cave cracks open and everyone falls into a tunnel slide thingy, which lands them in a cage inside the mountain. Goblins then run towards them, rounding them up and taking them to the Great Goblin. However, during the commotion, Bilbo manages to slip away. Unfortunately for him though, one goblin sees him and they fight, causing them both to fall deeper into the cavern below. The movie then cuts back to the dwarves with the Great Goblin, and we see the large monster sing a song, which is only in the extended edition by the way, and I'm really happy they removed it from the theatrical release. The song is not pretty. Anyway, Thorin is eventually revealed, and the Great Goblin sends word to the Pale Orc about his capture. We then cut back to Bilbo, who wakes up amid mushrooms deep in the mountain, and he sees Gollum come up and take the goblin who fell with Bilbo. But Bilbo stays unseen. He also watches the ring fall out of Gollum's pocket as he beats the goblin unconscious. And then Bilbo picks it up and puts it inside of his own pocket. He then sneaks after Gollum and eventually meets him, and they play the iconic riddle game. I won't go into each riddle right now, but after Gollum fails to answer Bilbo's final question, the creature gets really upset and realizes that he lost the ring. He then comes to the conclusion that Bilbo stole it, and so Bilbo makes a run for it. The movie then cuts back to the dwarves, and we see Gandalf save the day before the torture can begin, and they all run away as well, fighting goblins as they go. Then, going back to Bilbo, we see him get stuck in a small passage and just barely squeeze through, which causes him to fall. The ring goes flying in the air and then lands perfectly on his finger, causing him to disappear. The dwarves and Gandalf escape after killing off the Great Goblin, and Bilbo escapes as well after jumping over Gollum. Bilbo then meets up with Thorin's company in the woods to the shock of everyone who definitely thought he was dead. There's a heartfelt moment in which Bilbo explains why he came back, but it is short-lived as Azog approaches with his wargs, and they soon surround the company who have all climbed into the trees. Gandalf does what he can by lighting pine cones on fire and throwing them down at the beasts, and he also sends a message through a butterfly that he finds in the tree. Eventually, the trees begin to fall over, and Thorin makes a stand against Azog, pretty quickly being knocked over. Bilbo then runs over and defends Thorin, showcasing his Hobbit bravery, and the rest of the dwarves eventually start fighting as well. Thankfully, before all hope is lost, the eagles arrive and carry off Thorin's company. After a while, they come to rest on top of a strangely shaped stone, and Thorin almost dies, but Gandalf saves him. He thanks Bilbo for saving his life, and then they look in the distance and see the Lonely Mountain, with the movie ending on the beautiful shot of the entire company staring out at their old home. And that finishes up all the scenes we're covering today, which happens to be the rest of the scenes in this first movie. So let's jump into things by starting with our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. As usual, these categories are quite simple, and starting with characters, we only have two deviations. First, we obviously have the issue of Azog once again. In case this is your first time watching, he's actually dead in the books, and it's Bolg who is in charge of the orcs. But as we'll see in the plot changes, they aren't hunting Thorin's company anyway, so even if Azog were alive, it still wouldn't make sense. Anyway, the second character difference is that the eagles talk. This also happens in the Lord of the Rings books, but Peter Jackson chose a long time ago to just make the eagles speak in squawk squawk instead of the common tongue. As for timeline, this is a very interesting one. Similarly to when the Fellowship of the Ring goes through the mines of Moria, time passes differently underground. Gandalf tells Bilbo later that they went into the mountain on Monday or Tuesday and they got out on Thursday. So Bilbo had been underground for multiple days, groping his way through the dark tunnels. And lastly, for the location category, I think we can give it a pass this week. If you noticed any issues with locations though, drop a comment below. The first change we have is a simple one. Gandalf is still with Thorin's company, and they still have their ponies and all their supplies. If you remember from the last episode, there is no sneaking out of Rivendell like the movie shows, and so Gandalf doesn't stall for time. Elrond sets them up with supplies and even gives Gandalf a larger pony to ride, and then he sends them on their way. We also learn that Gandalf and Elrond had studied all their possible paths and decided upon the one that was least dangerous. And speaking of danger, that brings us to the second change, which is that they don't nearly die in a thunder battle. In the movie, we literally watch as half the company gets smashed between two rocks, but then somehow survive it. I have no idea how this happened, but the book is a lot more simple. There are giants, yes, and there is a thunder battle, but Thorin's company does not get caught in the middle of it. And this also means that another change is the fact that Thorin doesn't save Bilbo from nearly falling off a cliffside, and he's not nearly as mean in the book. Movie Thorin hates Bilbo for no good reason, and I just don't understand it. Anyway, next, they don't randomly find shelter like in the movie, but rather we read that they sent Fili and Kili to hunt for shelter, and the two dwarves came back saying that they found a cave. Gandalf was skeptical, asking if they had investigated the whole thing, and they said that they did. So the entire company went inside, and Gandalf did his own investigation, giving it the all clear. Although, just like in the movie, they did not light a fire. Instead, they all changed out of their soaked clothing, and they took out their pipes and blew smoke rings. Slowly, they went to sleep one by one, and that is our next change, and a pretty big one, which is that Bilbo doesn't try to leave and head back to Rivendell. That is completely made up for the movie, as in the book he is pretty well stuck in, and although he misses home, I don't think he even viewed it as a possibility to trek all the way back to Rivendell by himself. Plus, I think in the book he viewed wherever Gandalf was as the safest place, so since Gandalf is still with them, why would he leave? Next, the movie also decided to make a small adjustment to how they get captured by goblins. Instead of a trapdoor underneath them and a slide in the book, there's simply a door which the goblins come out of to grab them. But the interesting part is Bilbo's dream. Right before the goblins appear, Bilbo had a nightmare about cracks appearing in the cave, and he wakes up to see that the dream is real. He then screams, which wakes up Gandalf, who disappears in a bright flash, killing a couple goblins in the process. The dwarves, though, were much too slow in their waking, and they get captured along with Bilbo. Now, another major difference is that Bilbo doesn't slip away right at the beginning of their capture, but is actually with them when they meet the Great Goblin, and when Gandalf reappears. We'll see how he truly gets lost in a little bit. But first, we have a couple of other changes regarding this Great Goblin. First, Thorin actually tries to be polite to the goblin and talk his way out of this mess. He introduces himself and even says, "At your service." We learn that goblins are evil creatures, but they don't have a specific hate for dwarves. They really don't like elves, and the only dwarves they hate are the ones who were involved in the wars many years ago. And unfortunately for Bilbo and his new friends, Thorin and his father are kind of the reason those wars began. So once Thorin introduces himself, the Great Goblin isn't pleased. But that's not what sends him over the edge. It's actually when another goblin reveals Orcris to the Great Goblin that they begin to freak out. Just like in the movie, they hate this blade, and so after seeing it, the Great Goblin orders his people to torture the dwarves, and he runs straight for Thorin himself. Thankfully, just like in the movie, Gandalf reappears with a bright flash, which blinds and distracts the enemy, and Thorin's company makes a run for it. But the change here is that Gandalf actually kills the Great Goblin right then and there as he was charging at Thorin. It isn't saved for later like the movie shows. Also, it isn't really specified, but I don't think the Great Goblin was as big as the movie shows. He was just bigger than the average goblin. Now remember, Bilbo is still with them at this point, which brings us to the next change, and that is that they take turns carrying Bilbo, whose short legs aren't fast enough to keep up with the dwarves. But when Dori is carrying the Hobbit, he gets attacked from behind, causing him to drop Bilbo, who falls to the ground and hits his head on a rock, getting completely knocked out. He doesn't fight a goblin like the movie showed earlier in the scene, and he doesn't fall dozens of feet into a cavern, which somehow he survives in the movie. And that leads us to the all-important chapter, Riddles in the Dark. There are quite a few differences between this scene in the movie and the original version in the book. Starting with Bilbo waking up after being knocked out for who knows how long, we read that he groped around in the darkness and found something odd, a cold piece of round metal. Somewhat unknowingly, he picked it up and put it in his pocket, and then he continued to feel around. Remember, it is pitch black. This isn't like the movie where somehow you can see inside the cave. There is no light. Bilbo is extremely distressed, but is comforted a little when he feels Sting under his clothes, and he realizes that the goblins hadn't searched him well enough to find it. So he takes it out and decides that he can't go backwards and he can't go sideways. So onward is the only option, which is a small change in itself, because the movie shows Bilbo witnessing Gollum carry off a goblin. But in the book, he doesn't see that, and so his finding of the lake in the mountain where Gollum lives is totally by chance. But eventually he does find it, and we read that luckily for Bilbo, Gollum wasn't particularly hungry at the time, and since his curiosity outweighed his hunger, Gollum crept up on the Hobbit and asked what it is, and eventually they begin their riddle game. Now the riddle game is quite similar to the movie, and it's one of the best scenes from the trilogy in my opinion. However, I do want to mention a few riddles that didn't quite make the cut, because there are actually a few more than what gets shown in the film. So here they are. Bilbo says, "An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place." This was a tough one for Gollum, who had to really stretch his memory back to when he lived above the mountain. But eventually he got the answer, which he said was sun on the daisies, the sun being the eye in the blue face and the daisy being the eye in the green face. Then Gollum asked this one, "It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, Ends life, kills laughter. Bilbo easily got this one, which was darkness, as he was currently surrounded by it. Then Bilbo had another, which was no legs lay on one leg, 2 legs sat near on 3 legs, 4 legs got some. Now when I read that for the first time, I was so confused, but I guess this is a common riddle back in the day. Gollum soon gets the answer, which is a fish, no legs, on a table, 1 leg, man, 2 legs, sitting on a stool, 3 legs, and a cat, 4 legs, gets the leftovers. Let me know in the comments if you've heard that one before or solved it before it was revealed in the book, because if you did, I'm very impressed. Anyway, the final riddle that got cut comes from Gollum, and it is, alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. And Bilbo nearly didn't get this one, except for the fact that a fish jumped out of the water right at that moment, and he realized that the answer was just that, a fish. Of course, besides those 4, we have the normal ones that the movie included, and normally I would understand cutting the extra riddles to save time, but since they added so much fluff to the movie, it just doesn't make much sense that they cut stuff that was actually in the book. But anyway, moving on, we still have a few more changes regarding Gollum and Bilbo's time in the heart of the mountain. The next change is a small detail I wanted to mention, which is that in the book, Gollum kept the ring at his island in the lake. He used to keep it on him all the time, but we read that it became difficult for him to wear constantly or have near him. So he kept it on his island and only retrieved it when he needed to accomplish some sneaky business. And this was one of those times. After failing Bilbo's last question, he said that he needed to gather some things before they went, meaning to go get the ring and then come back and kill Bilbo. But as he reached the island, he realized that the ring was gone. That's when Bilbo heard a scream and realized that Gollum was not happy about something. Which brings us to our next change, as the movie rewrote the way in which Bilbo wears the ring for the first time. I think they wanted to pay homage to the original trilogy, and so they made Bilbo fall like Frodo did in the Fellowship of the Ring. But in the Hobbit book, we read that Gollum kept asking Bilbo what he has in his pockets, and Bilbo wasn't sure. So as he turned and ran from Gollum, who he could tell no longer feared the sword and was in some sort of manic rage, Bilbo reached in his pocket and felt the cold metal he had put there earlier. And as the ring usually does in its sneaky way, it slipped onto his finger, causing him to disappear. Of course, he didn't know this just yet and was confused when he tripped and Gollum went past him without seeing him. Bilbo then overhears a conversation between Gollum and Smeagol as they decide what to do. And he learns the truth of the ring as Gollum says that the goblins will capture Bilbo and then take the ring and learn its powers. Gollum then decides to head for the exit to hopefully stop Bilbo, but by doing this, he leads invisible Bilbo right to it. Gollum then peers out through the crack, which is where the exit is, and he sees goblins guarding the door, which they had made many years ago. Gollum can't get up the courage to leave because he knows he isn't strong enough to take on the goblins. But Bilbo has to make up his mind on what to do, and just like in the movie, he leaps over Gollum. Unlike the movie, however, our next change is that he has to deal with the goblins. The movie makes it seem like this exit is a natural one in the mountain and there aren't any goblins nearby. But like I said, this door was made by the goblins and they guarded it well. And somehow, probably by a trick of the ring, it had slipped off of Bilbo's finger. And so suddenly, the goblins could see him. Quickly, he reached back in his pocket and found the ring and put it back on, causing himself to vanish right in front of their eyes, which freaked all the goblins out. In the commotion, he ran for the door and could just barely squeeze through, snapping the buttons on his vest in the process. As we know, the movie at least took inspiration from that part when Gollum is chasing him. Now before we head into the final part of Azog attacking them and the eagle rescue, I need to address what should be an obvious change, and that is that the entire escape sequence from the dwarves and Gandalf in the movie is completely made up and ridiculous. Although there is running and fighting, the idea that they did those crazy stunts and acrobatics and fell hundreds of feet while sliding on a bridge is absolutely insane. Plus, as I mentioned earlier, the Great Goblin was dead by that point. Anyway, now moving outside of the mountain, our first change out here has to do with Bilbo's reveal. It's slightly different in the book as he essentially gets in the middle of everybody and takes the ring off so he just pops up out of nowhere. This greatly astonishes all the dwarves and Gandalf, and afterward he explains his entire journey through the mountain and his encounter with Gollum, which he doesn't do in the movie. This explanation impresses all the dwarves a great deal, and they now think a lot more highly of their burglar, who somehow snuck through the mountain alone without getting caught. Of course, just like in the movie, he doesn't reveal the ring, but Gandalf is suspicious of him. And now we need to talk about the most obvious change among them all, which is the involvement of Azog and the orcs hunting Thorin's company. Simply put, those characters aren't involved, but the event itself does still happen. So what does the book really say about it? Well, while talking in the woods, they hear the howl of wolves, who are native to the area and often got up to evil deeds by raiding local villages and homes. They also had a partnership with the goblins of the mountain and often would meet them as they were supposed to do that night. And unfortunately for Thorin's company, they were standing right at that meeting place. So just like in the movie, they scramble up some trees to escape the oncoming wargs, and Gandalf throws fiery pine cones down on them, which seems to work for a little bit. However, nightfall comes and the goblins come out of the mountain. They are very pleased to see that the company is stuck in the trees, as they wanted revenge for the murder of their great goblin. So we read that they put out the fires everywhere except for under the trees where Thorin's company was, and then they fanned the flames. The goblins then sang songs and taunted the dwarves, knowing that they were stuck, and in that moment, it seemed like all hope was lost. But thankfully for Thorin's company, at the top of the mountain, the Lord of the Eagles was watching and saw the fires below. No, the Eagles weren't summoned by Gandalf. Rather, the Lord of the Eagles kept watch over those mountains, as he and his kin were of a noble and ancient race who hated evil. They often attacked goblins who ventured out of their caves and scared them back inside the mountain. So when he heard howling in the distance and the voices of goblins, he and his kin swooped down and rescued Gandalf and the dwarves from the sticky situation they were in. Bilbo was almost left behind once again, but just managed to jump and grab onto Dory's ankle as the birds carried them off. He then somehow hung on until they reached their first resting point, which is the final change for this week, as the movie just shows them being taken to Carrock, the high place that they're left at in the movie. But in the book, they are first taken to the Great Shelf, where Gandalf meets with the Lord of the Eagles and discusses plans to be taken farther along. Plus, they rest and eat because the company hasn't eaten for at least 3 days. The Eagles brought them rabbits and sheep, and then the dwarves prepared a mighty meal and then slept. It isn't until the next morning that they are then taken to Carrock and dropped off. And that is where we'll stop things for this week and for this movie. Oh, and by the way, I guess I'll throw this in here now that I'm thinking about it, but Thorin doesn't almost die. So, picking up with the opening of the second film, we see Thorin and the prancing pony and Gandalf sitting down at his table. They discuss the fact that someone is hunting down Thorin, and Gandalf encourages him to reclaim Erebor. They end their conversation as Gandalf mentions they'll need a burglar, and the movie cuts to Bilbo, who is scouting out some land as the company hides from Azog and his orcs. Bilbo sees the orcs run off, and then he turns to find a large bear-looking thing. Bilbo runs back to the company and alerts them of this new terror, and Gandalf guides them to somewhere they might be safe. As they run through a field to get to this safe house, the bear charges after them, and they just barely make it inside before getting caught. Gandalf then tells them that the bear is their host, and he is a skin changer. They then sleep in the house, and it isn't until the next morning that Gandalf introduces them to their host, Beorn. Before that, though, we get a quick scene of Azog being summoned back to Dol Guldur, where the necromancer talks with him about some upcoming war. Azog then tasks Bolg with hunting down Thorin's company, and we'll see more of him in future episodes. Then we cut back to Beorn's house, and in an extended edition scene, Gandalf tells the dwarves to only come out 2 by 2, and only on his signal. Then as he talks with Beorn, the dwarves get confused and begin coming out too fast, causing Beorn to be frightened and upset. What calms him down is when he sees Thorin walk out last. The movie then cuts to them eating, and Beorn reluctantly agrees to help them because he says that he hates orcs more than dwarves. The company then prepares to head out resupplied and rested, and Beorn speaks with Gandalf about the necromancer of Dol Guldur. Eventually they leave and make it to the edge of Mirkwood, where Gandalf leaves them so that he can go investigate said necromancer. He tells them to stay on the path, for if they leave it, they may never find it again, and that is where scenes in chapter end for this week. So let's jump right into the changes by going over our first 3 categories of characters, timeline, and location. First, our character category is pretty simple, and most of you know what I'm about to say. But for those of you who are new here, Azog is actually dead during the events of The Hobbit. Later in the book, during the Battle of 5 Armies, it is Azog's offspring, Bolg, who leads the orcs. Azog has been dead for quite a while by the time Thorin goes on his quest for Erebor, but besides him, we don't really have any other character issues. Next, regarding timeline, we once again have to mention that the Dol Guldur plot is warped for the film. It's partially true, but the timeline is quite off, and I actually made a full video about the complete timeline of Sauron's Secret Fortress, so instead of explaining everything here, you can just check that video out after you finish this video. Trust me, if you're planning on sticking around for this series, it's worth a watch, because almost every episode we have has a Dol Guldur issue. Anyway, the primary timeline change here is the fact that in the opening scene scene of the movie, Gandalf acts as though he knows nothing of Thrain's situation, because technically in the movie timeline, he has yet to find Thrain. But in Tolkien's timeline, Gandalf had already ventured into Dol Guldur and found Thrain about 90 years before the events of The Hobbit. So there's that. Finally, for location, we have an interesting addition that Peter Jackson made for this trilogy, and that is the High Fells of Rudar. By the way, I'm probably butchering that name, but it doesn't matter because it's made up. There is another Rudar in Tolkien's lore, but it's completely separate and unrelated. The High Fells of Rudar never appear in Tolkien's lore because, as far as I'm aware, the Nazgul were never buried. So the idea that they were entombed and then somehow escaped their tomb is just completely false. If you'd be interested in a video all about the complete timeline and lore of the 9 Nazgul, let me know in the comments. First up, let's address the Azog stuff right off the bat. Any scene including him, Bolg, or the Necromancer is made up and not in Tolkien's lore, mainly because, as we mentioned earlier, Azog is dead. But additionally, Thorin's company isn't being chased by an orc pack like the movie shows. We'll learn later that the goblins of the mountains were hunting them to avenge the Goblin King, but it's not like what the movie shows of Bilbo actively scouting and watching Azog and his group in the distance. They don't find out about the goblins hunting them until a day later. Now moving on to the real start of the movie, with Gandalf and Thorin meeting in the Prancing Pony, we have a pretty important change regarding Thrain and how he disappeared. Thorin recounts to Gandalf what happened to his father during their battle against Azog, but that is completely wrong. The Battle of Azanulbazar did indeed happen, and it resulted in Azog's death, but afterward, Thorin and his father took their people and settled in the Blue Mountains. It isn't until Thrain and a small company set out to investigate the Lonely Mountain that he was captured by Sauron's forces and taken to Dol Guldur, where Sauron took the last Dwarven ring from him. So no, he did not charge into battle and then get lost in the mix and disappear. But I get it, they saved time by not going into the longer explanation and instead just lumped him into the story that we're already being fed. Our next change takes us deeper into the chapter in question today, as Gandalf and Thorin's company leave the Carrock where the eagles drop them off and head towards Beorn's house. The movie moves around a small detail, which is the fact that at the very beginning of this chapter, Gandalf informs them that he must be leaving them soon, but he has a couple more days before this happens. The dwarves beg him to stay and try to bribe him with gold and treasures, but he says that this was never his quest, and he simply wanted to see them get past the Misty Mountains, which now they have. In the movie, Gandalf doesn't tell them he's leaving until they reach Mirkwood, and really in the movie, Gandalf doesn't know himself that he'll be leaving until that very moment, as he realizes that he has urgent matters to tend to elsewhere. Next, the scene that we do get, which shows Bilbo spying and then the dwarves running to Beorn's house, is a very abbreviated version of what the book says. And really, this is the first time we're seeing this happen in the trilogy. The entire first movie pretty much takes small chapters and extends them to 40 or 50 minutes of screen time. This week, however, we have a chapter that's about an hour long on Audible, but only 30 minutes on the screen. So they essentially cut half of it. And I am sad they did, because there's so much fluff added to this trilogy that could have been cut to make room for keeping other parts of the movie that were true to the book. But anyway, here's what really happens in the book. To start, no, Bilbo doesn't spy on anything, like we said. He simply walks along with Gandalf and asks him questions about where they're going and who their potential host is. Gandalf shares a great deal about Beorn with Bilbo and the others, telling them that he's a skin changer and that his origins trace back to the mountains, which is why he hates goblins and orcs. The company continued walking for many hours, and eventually by afternoon, they had reached the outskirts of Beorn's property where he kept his bees. They could tell this area was well maintained, and the bees were as big as Bilbo's thumb. And the next change here is that no, they were not chased by a bear, and they did not enter any home without permission. I never understood that part of the movie, as I doubt Beorn would have very much liked it if they slept in his house without his permission. Anyway, our next change is one that I'm so sad we never got to see, and that would be Beorn's many animals. I would call them servants, but that may sound a little extreme. Helpers might be a better word. Essentially, Beorn could speak to all of his animals, and they all had jobs around his home. As Gandalf and the others approached his gate, Gandalf gives instructions to only come 2 by 2, which we'll talk about in a minute. But he and Bilbo approach first, and as they do, they encounter a couple of horses who study them and then gallop off. Gandalf tells Bilbo that the horses are going to inform Beorn of strangers on his property. This is the first taste of Beorn's helpers, and we'll see more of them later as they have dinner. But now we can move into Gandalf and Bilbo's encounter with Beorn himself. And like I said at the beginning of this video, it's quite different. First, Beorn's attitude is vastly different in the book. I don't know why the movie made him seem so on edge, like he could kill you at any moment, because in the book he is pretty well-mannered and laid back. For example, as Gandalf and Bilbo walk up, Beorn dismisses his horses and tells them that these strangers don't look dangerous at all, and then he laughs loudly as he sets down his axe and walks toward them. That's right, he laughs. I don't know about you, but movie Beorn doesn't seem like he's ever laughed in his entire life. And later, as the dwarves approach and keep bowing to him, he finds them super amusing with their long beards bouncing up and down and waggling about. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look at what other changes there were besides his personality. The next change we have is that Beorn is genuinely interested in their story. As Gandalf and Bilbo approach, they introduce themselves and Beorn asks why they're there. Gandalf begins to explain how they were captured by goblins in the mountains. Beorn is immediately impressed that Gandalf killed a couple goblins right before they got captured, and this hooks him on the entire tale. So much so that he invites them inside, which is the next change. And again, this further reinforces what I was saying about book Beorn being so much more relaxed and hospitable than movie Beorn. As soon as Beorn hears about goblins, he invites Gandalf and Bilbo inside to tell him the full story, which is probably because he doesn't get many visitors anyway. And inviting two people inside seems pretty harmless. But that's the genius part of Gandalf's plan, which Bilbo realizes as they continue on. And that also brings us to the next change, which is that in the book, the dwarves do indeed come 2 by 2 and only every 5 minutes. In the extended scene of the movie, they have Gandalf do a signal instead of a timeline, which confuses the dwarves, causing them to come out way faster than every 5 minutes. And eventually, the last 5 or 6 just walk out all at once. It's a complete mess, and per usual in these films, it just turns the dwarves into comic relief. But in the book, this 2 by 2 strategy is very purposeful. As Gandalf goes through the story, he keeps mentioning things like several or troop. And each time he says one of these, Beorn asks what he means, because 2 isn't several, or 6 isn't a troop. And these were timed so that each time a new number was mentioned, 2 more dwarves would arrive. And while this might have normally annoyed Beorn, he was so captivated by the story that he would welcome the newcomers and then immediately turn back to Gandalf to have him go on. In typical Gandalf fashion, it really is a genius plan. Anyway, another small change here that I have to mention real quick is that Thorin actually comes first, not last. And I've gotta also say that Beorn would have never recognized Thorin by his face. Although the movies don't explicitly state this, the look Beorn gives is like he recognizes Thorin, which is insane. Movie adaptations tend to do this, but The Hobbit does this a lot with Thorin, and that is that they make all the characters in the universe somehow aware of what Thorin looks like, despite the fact that they didn't have photographs back then. How would Beorn have ever seen Thorin's face before? While Beorn could have heard of Thorin's name, he definitely would have never recognized him like he seems to do in the film. But anyway, that's just my little side tangent. To get back to the main changes, our next change is that Beorn happily offers them all dinner even after finding out about all of the extra dwarves. And he doesn't offer them dinner because he sees Thorin like the movie suggests, he offers them dinner as a payment for the tale that Gandalf shared. He is so impressed by their escape and all the goblins they killed that he invites them inside, telling them that it's the best story he's heard in a long while. And that brings us to the next change, which introduces us to even more animal helpers around the house. Again, I would have loved to see this in the movie, because in the book we read that dogs literally stood on hind legs and served them, horses rolled in stumps for extra seats, and sheep brought in plates and utensils and more. It's like The Hobbit became a Disney movie in a split second. It also just rounds out Beorn's character so much, and it makes you like him even more because he can communicate with these animals who obviously respect and adore him. It makes him feel a little bit more approachable and likable. Another thing that got cut and changed is their conversation during the meal. In the book, Beorn shares stories with them and they have a good time together. It's not a serious conversation like in the movie. They don't get down to business until the next day. For that night, they sleep peacefully in his house and they notice Beorn slip outside, and they don't see him again until tomorrow. Which brings us to our final few changes. The first of which is that when Bilbo awoke the next morning, he couldn't find Gandalf or Beorn anywhere. The dwarves had no idea where they were, but soon enough Gandalf arrived back and informed them that he was tracking bear prints, and he noticed that there was a large gathering of bears outside Beorn's house that past night. Then Beorn eventually returned, and we hear from him how he went outside to confirm Gandalf's story. He went to the mountains and captured a warg and a goblin, and they told him the full story, even saying that Gandalf slew the Goblin King, and now they were hunting Thorin's company. This is finally the first news of any hunting going on. Also, this is the first fierce side of Beorn that we see, as he shows them what he did to the goblin and warg, and we see a goblin head outside and a warg skin hanging there. Bilbo realizes in that moment that Beorn can be a great friend but a fierce enemy. However, the important part out of all of this is the fact that learning Gandalf killed the Goblin King is what makes Beorn love them all even more, and he eagerly offers them help, which is the next change. In the movie, it's a tense moment in which we don't know if Beorn will assist them or not, but in the book, he is more than happy to give them any and all aid. He provides them with ponies, water skins, food, which includes his famous honey cakes, bows to hunt in Mirkwood, and more. He even goes as far as to say that if Thorin or his people are ever in the area again, they're welcome in his home. Now, our second to last change is a small one, and that is that Beorn is the one who gives them advice about Mirkwood, not Gandalf. In the movie, Gandalf tells them about the path and the water and all that, but in the book, Beorn tells them those details because he's more familiar with the area. And finally, our last change this week is regarding when they actually get to Mirkwood in the movie. There is no symbol of Sauron's eye on a statue, Gandalf doesn't have a telepathic conversation with Galadriel, and obviously, like we said earlier, he doesn't leave them abruptly, but rather he had warned them days before that he wouldn't continue on with them into Mirkwood. Picking up from where we left off last week, with Gandalf leaving Thorin's company on the edge of Mirkwood, we see them all begin their trek through the dark forest. There's a bit of a walking montage as they attempt to stay on the path as best they can, and the dwarves of course are complaining the whole time. Eventually they find a bridge that is broken, and the only way across seems to be some vines, which they have Bilbo test as he is the lightest. Then after Bilbo makes it across, all the other dwarves begin to cross together, which by the way, this is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. You're telling me that you were so worried about the vines that you intentionally sent the lightest person to go first, but as soon as he crosses, you all dogpile onto the vines? I guess we can write off the stupidity due to the dark magic of the forest. Anyway, after crossing, they see a deer jump into view and Thorin tries to shoot it, but he misses. Then Bombur falls into the water, which they learned from Gandalf was enchanted. They pull Bombur out because he is fast asleep, and so they now must carry him. Bilbo begins to hear voices, and Thorin eventually leads his company off the path, but eventually, after realizing they lost their way, Bilbo climbs up a tree and gets a breath of fresh air, seeing the lonely mountain in the distance. He tries to call down to the others, but they don't reply, and then when he attempts to climb down himself, he trips and encounters a spider who wraps him up. Eventually, Bilbo wakes up as he is being dragged by a spider to their nest, but he uses Sting to kill the beast. He then cuts himself out of the web and puts on the ring, which helps him understand the spiders talking. He decides to throw something to distract the spiders, and they run off toward the noise. After killing the last spider left there to guard the dwarves, he begins to free his company, and they all start fighting. At one point, Bilbo drops his ring and falls to the ground. And once he wakes up, he sees a baby spider near the ring and he kills it in order to get his precious back. After realizing what he did, he feels sick. But while he's going through that experience, the dwarves are trying to fight off the spiders and eventually get saved by elves. The dwarves are searched and then taken captive by the elves, but Bilbo is still free because he got separated from them during his fall. And that is where our scenes end for this week. I know that's a lot, but the chapter in the book is much more. So let's waste no time and jump right into things with our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. This week, these three categories are pretty simple, and starting with characters, you probably know all the differences. Legolas and Tauriel are not in the Hobbit book. Of course, Legolas exists in Tolkien's lore, but Tauriel does not. She was made up just for the films. Also, Gimli gets a brief shout out here, which he doesn't in the book. But I don't mind this moment in the movie because it's a nice little bit of foreshadowing for Legolas's future best friend. Next, our timeline is pretty messed up, mainly because it's hard to tell the passage of time while they're in the woods. I know in the book they're wandering around for about a month before the elves capture them, but in the movie it only seems like a day. This is mainly because they don't show the company camping overnight. The Lord of the Rings movies did a decent job of showing some moments of the Fellowship camping out, which helped the viewer recognize the long journey. But by the way that their trek through Mirkwood is put together, you would think it was a single day that this happened for them in the film. Anyway, thankfully our location category this week gets a pass. They're in Mirkwood pretty much the whole time, and the visual is pretty accurate to the book description, so no complaints here. Our first change for this week, of course, has to do with their first few steps into Mirkwood. While the movie shows us a montage of walking around, we get several more details in the book, which also support the theory of their being trapped in the forest for a month. Specifically, we learn that they did stop to camp at nighttime, and they took turns being on watch duty. This is our first hint at the evil of the woods and the spiders lurking there, as Bilbo notes that at nighttime you could see many glowing eyes staring back at you from the darkness. The group tried to light fires, but eventually stopped doing that because the fire seemed to attract even more eyes than before. Plus, the fire would also attract dark moths the size of your hands. Besides their camping, we also learn about their attempts at hunting, which were mostly futile. Eventually, they did manage to shoot a squirrel, but after eating it, they did decide to stop hunting the animals of Mirkwood, because the squirrel tasted disgusting. Also, I'm not sure how much food one squirrel could provide for 14 people. And this was the first problem they ran into, as they ran out of food quite quickly, and obviously the hunting wasn't going to work. So they needed to find a way out of the forest and fast. And this extreme hunger will play a massive role later on, but first, we need to move into our second change, which has to do with the bridge. The short version is that their crossing of the river is entirely different in the book. But you didn't just come for the short version, so here's what really happened. Well, first of all, it is a wooden bridge, not a stone one, but that's the least of our worries regarding the changes. The more important difference is the way in which they get across. No, they didn't climb on vines, they used a boat. And it's thanks to Bilbo that they get across, because his keen eyes are the ones that saw the boat that the others could not. After Bilbo spotted the boat on the opposite bank, the dwarves fashioned a rope with a hook and tossed it across, eventually snagging the boat and dragging it towards them. Then, slowly but surely, they used the rope to get everyone across until Dwalin and Bombur were the last to come. So no, there were no vines. But how did Bombur fall in? Well, that brings us to our next change, which is that Bombur doesn't just fall asleep and drop into the water like the extended scene shows. He actually gets knocked over by the deer. Remember the deer they see in this scene? Well, they do see one in the book, but it's not so far away from them. It actually runs right through them and jumps over Bombur to get to the opposite bank. So as Bombur made it to the other side and got 1 foot out of the boat, the deer knocked him off balance and he fell in. Eventually, using their rope, they got Bombur out, but he was fast asleep, enchanted by the water. Then the dwarves all cursed their luck, as the fattest one among them was of course the one who got knocked out, and now they have to carry him. By the way, another change with that moment is the fact that Thorin's aim was true in the book, and he did shoot an arrow at the deer, supposedly killing it. Unfortunately, he hit it when it was already on the other side of the river, so they were unable to retrieve it and eat it. Later, while they're waiting for Bombur to awake, they hear some horns in the forest as if a hunt is taking place. Then suddenly, a hind and a couple fawns appear and the dwarves shoot their final arrows at them, but they all miss. Thorin tries to yell at them to stop, but it's too late and all their arrows are now gone. So now with all of their arrows gone, they are left starving in Mirkwood with only a few crumbs left in their rations for the rest of the journey. Next, we come to the moment in which Bilbo climbs a tree. But there's a distinct change here, and that is the fact that in the book, it's actually Thorin's idea to have the Hobbit do this. A few days after the incident at the stream, they encounter an area of straight tall beech trees, and they can hear disquieting laughter in the distance. Then a couple days after that, they get to an area of tall great oaks, and they seem to be going mad. At this point, after carrying Bombur for days and having barely any food, Thorin has had enough. He thinks that if someone could climb a tree and see where they were, then perhaps they'll have a better plan of action. And by the way, they're still on the path at this point. Of course, by somebody, he meant Bilbo. Bilbo reluctantly does so, as he does not have much practice in the art of climbing trees, and when he gets to the top, we have a pretty massive change, which is the fact that he does not see anything useful. That's right, no lonely mountain, no lake. He simply sees the forest stretch on and on. Tolkien writes that they were actually in a small valley of the forest, and despite the tree being the tallest one in that valley, it still was surrounded on all sides by other trees, blocking Bilbo's view. So to Bilbo, it looked like endless trees. He does get a breath of fresh air and he enjoys the sun, but he has no good news to report to the company. And our next change is that no, this is not when Bilbo gets separated from the dwarves. The spiders do not attack until much later. Like I said, this chapter is one of the longest, over an hour on the audiobook, so we've still got some interesting events to cover before the spiders show up. And that brings us to the next change, and that is when Bombur finally wakes up. There's really no details about this in the movie, as they skip over a lot of moments between the extra dwarves and the company. But in the book, Bombur has more speaking parts than you'd think. Shortly after the failed tree experiment, they camp for the night as they eat the last of their crumbs, and then Bombur awakes suddenly. He tells them about the fantastic dream he was having, about a feast with an elven king. The other dwarves pretty much tell him to shut up because they don't want to hear anything about a feast with the current state of their stomachs. Another interesting detail here is that Bombur doesn't remember anything about their adventure. The last thing he says he remembers is the dinner party at Bag End, so he has a hard time believing all the wild stories that the other dwarves are telling him happened. By the end of it, he says he just wants to go back to sleep and dream about the feast again. But they refuse to let him sleep, saying that they've carried his fat butt around long enough. Now, one might think that Bombur's dream would just be from him simply being hungry, but it turns out that the magic of the forest is stronger than that, and the dream is connected to reality. And now we've come to one of the most interesting parts of this chapter, which is a string of events that got completely cut from the movie. You see, as the dwarves are in the woods, they see lights in the distance. With how hungry the dwarves are, they insist on going to investigate, but Thorin says they shouldn't leave the path, which is kind of the first change here. The movie made Thorin kind of go crazy, but honestly in the book, he's the only one with any sense during these moments. In the movie, it's Thorin's idea to leave the path, but in the book, he's pretty much the only one who doesn't want to. Unfortunately for him, despite being their leader, he's outvoted by a landslide. The other dwarves are starving. The lights in the distance might mean food. And since Bombur wouldn't stop talking about his dreams of a feast, the others decided that they would go look at the lights, and so they all plunged into the darkness together. So what happens? Well, that's our next change, as this is where we get introduced to the elves of Mirkwood. Much more mischievous than their kin, the elves were partying it up and feasting in the forest. But due to some sort of magic, they would disappear anytime Thorin's company got close. We read that Bilbo and the others would approach and see the feast, the tables of food, the elven king, and they'd hear singing and dancing, but as soon as they would step into the light, the flames would go out and everything would go dead silent as if by magic. But that's just the first time, and things get interesting as the event repeats. That's right, it doesn't just happen once. Soon after their first attempt, they see lights pop up in a different part of the forest, and they go after it once again. But thinking to be sneakier, Thorin sends Bilbo first, as he guesses that a hobbit would be less intimidating to the elves. As Bilbo steps into the feast light, everything goes dark again and Bilbo passes out, falling under a similar enchantment to Bombur. In the pitch black, it takes a while for the dwarves to find him again, curled up and asleep on the ground. Eventually, they rouse Bilbo and he tells them about the wonderful dream he was having of a feast, which sounds just like Bombur's dream. And that leads us into another change as we read about their third encounter with the elves and their feast, because this is where the spiders finally come into play. Like we discussed already, Bilbo doesn't get separated from the dwarves because of him climbing a tree. He gets separated because of another one of these feasts. They see the lights in the distance for a third time, and this time Thorin decides to step out alone. Once again, everything goes dark, and Bilbo gets separated from the rest of the company in the darkness. Due to his prior experience, he still has the enchantment on him, and he eventually falls asleep on the ground, unable to resist the magic. It isn't until a while later that he wakes up and finds himself in an odd predicament. He opens his eyes to see a spider wrapping him up, already having his legs tied together. Just like any of us would, Bilbo freaks out and starts punching the spider, causing it to back off long enough for him to grab his sword and cut his legs free. He then kills the spider with the sword and passes out from exhaustion. When he comes to, he sees the spider dead beside him, and this is when he names the sword Sting. But now he's in a sticky situation, in more ways than one, as he looks around and he realizes that he has completely lost his way, and he doesn't know where Thorin or the other dwarves have gone off to. And this leads us into the next change, in which Bilbo handles the spider situation quite differently in the book. After killing the large spider all by himself, Bilbo gets a boost of courage and eventually finds where the spiders have taken the dwarves. All he has to do is remember where he heard voices from the night before, and he walks in that direction long enough until he finds their hideout. At this point, he has already slipped on the ring and disappeared, so he could do some reconnaissance. He watched as the spiders discussed what to do with the dwarves, one pinching the nose of Bombur to see if he was dead, and Bombur yelped and kicked the spider. This angered them, and instead of throwing a branch like the movie shows, Bilbo did something quite odd. He throws stones at them. That's right, he picks up a smooth stone and chucks it at the spider who's bothering Bombur, knocking it out or killing it in one shot. He then repeats this, taking out multiple other spiders, who are now very upset as they can't see what's happening. He realizes that he can't throw stones from there forever, and he needs to lead the spiders to somewhere else. So he begins to sing a song, taunting them. Remember, the Hobbit book contains many songs. Honestly, the movie could have been a musical, but thankfully it wasn't. Anyway, he calls the spiders names and sings to them, all while throwing stones at them and stamping around. This causes almost all the spiders in the place to run in the direction of the sound, and after a bit, they surround him. But Bilbo is still invisible, and he has Sting, so he simply cuts through their webs which were meant to trap him, and he leads them off once again. This time though, after sending them in a specific direction, he stops singing and goes quiet, circling back around to where the dwarves are kept. This buys him just enough time to free some of the dwarves, who, by the way, are still poisoned. They get up, half drugged, and lazily begin to help Bilbo free the rest of the company. But eventually, the spiders return and the fight begins. The dwarves try their best, but Bilbo is really the one who does all the work here. And by the way, before he freed the dwarves, he had taken off his ring so they could see him. This is honestly some of Bilbo's best work, and it goes to show just how fierce he can be. We don't really see this epic side of him in the movie because, ironically, they kept this part a little more realistic than the book. For example, there's a part in the book in which Bomber is being dragged off again, and Bilbo jumps down from a tree into the middle of 6 spiders and kills all of them. It's pretty epic, but I have a hard time seeing that happen if they're as big as the movie shows them being. Anyway, eventually all the dwarves are freed and they begin to run off as best they can. Now, real quick before we get to the most important change of the week, there's a small difference here, which is the fact that the part of the movie in which Bilbo kills the baby spider to get the ring back is completely made up. He never drops the ring in the book, and he never falls to the ground like they show, and therefore he doesn't need to kill a baby spider. I get the idea behind this moment, but why is he feeling bad about killing the baby spider? That thing is evil. Are we really sympathizing with it just because it's a baby? Anyway, moving on to the bigger change here, let's finally talk about the big reveal of Bilbo telling the others about the ring. You see, he's kind of stuck, because they're running while the spiders are attacking them, and Bilbo can see that the dwarves are no use. They're still drugged from the spider venom, and therefore they can't really put up a fight. So he looks at them and tells them that he is going to disappear. And once he does, they must make a run for it to the left. He says that he'll lead the spiders away. The dwarves don't understand what he means, until he does exactly what he said he would and suddenly vanishes right in front of their eyes. They are shocked, but Balin thankfully has enough wits about him to understand the plan. So he guides the company to the left as Bilbo begins his singing again and calling the spiders names, causing them to be led off in the opposite direction. Suddenly, his singing stopped, and the dwarves feared the worst, until Bilbo appeared out of thin air right in front of them and told them to keep running. This bought them a little extra time as the spiders still chased them, but eventually they made it to a clearing where one of the feasts from the night before was held. At this location, the spiders stopped chasing them, seeming to not like the good magic that surrounded that elven feasting area. And with that, the spider fiasco finally ended and the company was safe. Well, part of the company. You see, after forcing Bilbo to explain himself regarding the ring and tell them the full story of the mountain and Gollum and all that fun stuff, they realize they're missing one very important person, Thorin. And that brings us to the final change of the week, which is that Thorin was captured by elves before any of the spider stuff ever happened. That's right, just like Bilbo, when Thorin stepped into the third feast the night before, he immediately passed out under the magic of the elves, and in the darkness, the dwarves never found him. Of course, at the same time, the spiders attacked, so they all got separated, but the spiders must have missed Thorin, who was laying on the ground asleep. But Thorin still got captured, just not by spiders. Rather, the elves got to him first, and he was taken to the Elven King. I'll get into the specifics of their conversation in the next episode, but for now, just know that Thorin's company was separated from their leader, and they thought him lost in the woods or dead. So eventually, when they were captured by the elves as well, which they were shortly after escaping the spiders, they were imprisoned separately from Thorin. It isn't until later when Bilbo searches the caves that he finds Thorin in a separate prison. But again, that's a whole batch of changes that we can address in the next episode. So, picking up from where we left off in the last episode, we see our dwarves being captured by the wood elves who are led by Legolas. Meanwhile, Bilbo uses the ring to sneak in after them without being seen by any of the elves. After the dwarves get locked up, we see Thorin talk with Thranduil, the king of the Woodland Realm. Thorin rejects Thranduil's offer to help, calling the Elven King out for not holding to his word all those years ago. Thranduil is obviously offended by this and sends Thorin away to rot in a cell. But Thorin knows there's still a hobbit on the loose who might be able to help save them. After this, we see a scene in which Thranduil tells Tauriel to not give his son Legolas hope for love. Tauriel then leaves the king and goes down to check on the prisoners, and she ends up talking with Killy and they flirt about the moon and stuff like that. Blah. Sometime later, we see Bilbo figuring out a way for the dwarves to escape, and after stealing the guards' keys, he goes and helps free them from their cells. Then he guides the dwarves deeper into the caves where the cellar is located, and he tells them to get inside the barrels. Thorin reinforces this command, and the dwarves reluctantly hop into their barrels. Bilbo then opens the trapdoor to let all of the barrels fall into the stream below, but he realizes that he has no way of getting out as the trapdoor closes. At this point, the elves have figured out that the dwarves have escaped their cells and started coming downstairs. Luckily for Bilbo, he falls through the trapdoor after backing far enough up, and he disappears right as the elves run into the cellar. We then get the one and only barrel scene that has made waves through the Tolkien fandom, pun intended. After the dwarves get stuck at the river gate, which the elves closed, Bolg and his orcs finally attack. The elves then turn their attention to the orcs, and this gives Killy the opportunity to climb out of his barrel and open the river gate to allow their barrels through. But during this heroic deed, he gets shot by an orc archer in the leg. Then there's a lot more fighting and action as they float along the rapids during the battle between the elves and the orcs. But eventually, the elves give up their chase and allow the barrels to continue on as they take an orc captive back to Thranduil. In the midst of this, the movie cuts to a brief scene of Gandalf and Radagast finding the tombs of the Nazgul empty. But then the movie quickly cuts back to the dwarves who run into Bard as they come to the shore. Balin talks to Bard, and eventually they strike a deal before being smuggled into Lake Town. And finally, the movie cuts back to Thranduil, Legolas, and Tauriel as they interrogate the orc that they captured. And the scene ends with Thranduil killing the orc, and then Legolas finding out that Tauriel left the kingdom to pursue the orcs that were chasing the dwarves. So now that we've refreshed our memories on these scenes, let's begin our analysis with our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First, our characters category has some quite impactful changes this week, although they are easily explained away. Legolas, Tauriel, Bard, and Bolg are not in these scenes. Obviously, Tauriel is completely made up and Legolas is real, but he isn't anywhere to be found in the Hobbit book. As for Bard and Bolg, they are in the Hobbit book, but they don't appear in this chapter. Also, I've mentioned this before, but Thranduil technically isn't named anywhere in the Hobbit book, and is only referred to as the Elven King. We later find out in Tolkien's other writings that the Elven King was named Thranduil, so it's not totally incorrect. The incorrect part is how much the movies involve Thranduil, when Tolkien gave him such a small role that he didn't even bother naming him. And speaking of small roles, Killy is nowhere near a main character in the books. Bombur probably has more speaking parts than Killy in the book, yet in the movies they turn him into a main character for the sake of the love triangle, which we'll see develop later. But anyway, moving into our timeline category, we have a change that is in a bit of a gray area. You see, technically in the book, they're imprisoned in Thranduil's dungeons for nearly a month. That's right, a whole month. Whereas in the movie, it seems like literally one day. It's a gray area because technically one could argue that they were in there for a month, but the movie just cut out all the extra time. It's just that, in my opinion, the movie doesn't give any sense of a passage of time, and the way that the moments fit together make you think that things happened back to back. For example, Tauriel speaks to Thranduil on the same day that the dwarves are captured. Then she leaves Thranduil and goes to speak to Killy, who mentions the party the elves are having. We then see Bilbo steal the keys from the guards and the butler as they get drunk because of said party. So it would be incredibly difficult for Peter Jackson to say, well, time did pass, but we just didn't show it, because this string of events in the movie really makes it seem like they were freed in the same day. But let me know what you think in the comments. Now finally, before we get to the plot changes, we need to address our location category, which only has two differences. First, the portcullis, which we see in the movie as the river gate, is technically inside the caves in the book. It's right where the trapdoor releases the barrels in the water, not a half a mile down the stream, but that's not such a big deal. The bigger location change is the addition of a whole new place that alters Tolkien's lore entirely, and that location is the High Fells of Rudar. Again, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but this is where Gandalf and Radagast go to find the Nazgul tombs. I've already addressed this in past episodes, but if you're new here, the Nazgul were never buried. Peter Jackson made up this location, and Gandalf never visits here in the book. If you want the full Dol Guldur timeline, you can check out that video on my channel to learn more. To start things off, we need to overlap with last episode a little bit and repeat that the dwarves don't get saved by the elves and then captured. In the book, the dwarves escape the spiders all on their own, making it to one of the elves' feasting areas from the night before. No elves are there, and the leftover magic scares off the spiders. The dwarves then fall asleep one by one from exhaustion, and it isn't until they awake and start walking through the woods that they encounter some elves who leap out and capture them. But just like the movie, Bilbo quickly slips away during this time. Next, Thorin isn't with the company when they get captured, as in the book, he got captured the night before. Remember from last episode how we talked about the feasting wood elves? Well, during the last feast that the dwarves saw, Thorin was the one who stepped into the light, and because of this, he was put under a spell, knocking him out. He missed out on the entire spider fiasco as he lay asleep on the forest floor. He then was captured by the elves and taken to the Elven King, who questioned him. When Thorin wouldn't answer any of his questions, the king put Thorin in a deep dungeon all by himself. Then that leads us into the next change, which is the fact that in the book, all of the other dwarves were also questioned by the king when they arrived in his palace. The king did not inform them of Thorin's arrival, so the entire company thought him dead or lost in the woods. Balin spoke for the rest of the company and was very blunt with the king as they all were starving and very grumpy. He said that they did nothing wrong and then asked if the spiders were the king's pets and if killing them made him upset. This comment greatly upset Thranduil and he locked all of the dwarves away as well, each in a separate cell so that they could not speak to one another. They also were locked on a separate level from Thorin, so they still never met him. And now that our dwarves are locked up, this brings up an addition that the movie made, which is never in the books. Obviously, you probably know what I'm speaking of, because in the character section we mentioned that Tauriel is made up. Therefore, her flirting with Killy in the dungeon is completely fabricated for the film, and it won't be the last time that we have a change like that today. Next though, the movie removed Bilbo's month-long stay in the caves as he figured out a way to save Thorin's company. I know I mentioned it in the timeline changes already, but it is also a plot change because we don't hear any of the details about this waiting period. We read in the book that Bilbo wore the ring the entire time he was there, for fear that he would be caught if he ever removed it. He also writes that he would leave the palace every once in a while as the elves went out on hunts, but in the book we learn that the front gate is magical and those who enter cannot escape without the king's leave, nor can they enter. So Bilbo always made sure to exit and re-enter with the elves without being seen, for if he got locked out without them, he may never have been able to get in again. We read about how this was Bilbo's most miserable month so far in the journey, stealing food and drink each day to survive and hiding in the dark corners of the cave, as his shadow could be seen if he walked around in the light. Essentially, this whole month he experienced a small taste of what Gollum felt for hundreds of years. He barely slept, and he writes, "I am like a burglar that can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day." But eventually his luck did turn around, and that brings us to our next change, as after a couple of weeks he finally located the dwarves, which goes to show how massive Thranduil's palace was in these caverns, as it took weeks to find the cells where his friends were being kept. But as we know in the movies, Bilbo pretty much knows where they are immediately. In the book, we learn that it took him some time, but eventually he found each cell for the first 12 dwarves, which were all in separate parts of the palace. Then one day he heard some guards speaking about a different dwarf, separate from the 12, and Bilbo immediately knew that this had to be Thorin. So after finding Thorin, he spoke with him at length about their predicament, and Thorin told Bilbo to send word to each of the other dwarves, and so Bilbo did just that. Keep in mind, Thorin was not there the night before when Bilbo told the others about his ring, so this is also the first time that Thorin would have learned about Bilbo's magical ring. After all, when Bilbo started talking to him, he thought he was just hearing voices in his head from going insane, because Bilbo was still invisible. Obviously in the movie, the dwarves don't hear from Bilbo until he gets the keys and frees them, but in the book, as you can see, he has communication with them after finding that they're imprisoned. The message that Thorin told Bilbo to give was one of hope, essentially telling them not to share anything with the king about their travels or their goal, and that their incredible Mr. Baggins would help them get out. This of course put a lot of pressure on Bilbo, but once again he pulls through, as we'll soon see. However, before we get to the barrels themselves, I wanted to throw out another change here, which is related to some dialogue. Like I said, I don't often bring up dialogue changes unless they impact the story, and I think this one does, as when Thorin is talking to Thranduil in the movie, the Elven King immediately knows what his journey is. He knows that Thorin is going to reclaim the Lonely Mountain. But I want to make it clear that in the book, the Elven King does not know this, or at least he does not tell the reader that he knows this. He asks Thorin many questions, but they all come back to the same thing. What is your purpose in my realm? This gives off the vibe that the Elven King doesn't know who Thorin is or why he's traveling through Mirkwood. Obviously, this is different from the movie, which makes every character somehow fully aware of who this dwarf is and what he is doing, despite there being no means for quick communication in Middle-earth. I don't know why the movie makes it seem like everybody has iPhones in Middle-earth and they're just FaceTiming each other with this information and sending pictures of Thorin's face back and forth, as somehow everyone in the films recognizes Thorin by his face, which is impossible in the book, especially since Book Thranduil never betrayed Thorin's people back when Smaug attacked. Whereas in the prologue of the movie, we saw how Thranduil turned his back on them, which is a made-up moment. But anyway, I figured I'd mention that because this insider knowledge of Thorin's journey greatly alters the way that we look at Thranduil in the book versus the movie. I will say that in the Hobbit book, we get a brief amount of lore and history on the woodland elves, and we do learn that they often were a lot greedier for jewels in the mountains, specifically white gems. As we've already addressed in a previous episode, the part of the movie where Thranduil wants these white gems because they used to be his wives, who is now dead, is completely made up, but I think they got inspired for that movie moment from this part of the book. because Tolkien writes that the elves used to get along with the dwarves until they promised payment to the dwarves and never gave it to them. And like I said, Tolkien writes that the elves really like the white gems in the mountains. It's just a lot more vague in the book and isn't attached to a specific person or sentimental reason like they have Thranduil's wife in the movie. Anyway, next up we have another small change that I'm obligated to mention because it's my duty. And that is that Tauriel and Thranduil do not have a conversation about Legolas and how Thranduil doesn't want Tauriel to give his son false hope. Of course, that's all baloney. But now we come to the moment that you've all been waiting for, the Great Escape. Similarly to the movie, Bilbo finds out that there is a cellar, and that the front door isn't the only way out of the palace, as the elves have to transport wine and other goods to and from Lake Town through a trapdoor in the cellar. So one night, Bilbo steals the guard's keys after he and the butler get drunk, and he goes to free the dwarves. The first change we come upon with this escape is the demeanor of the dwarves themselves regarding Bilbo's plan. And unlike the movie, Thorin is also not happy about this. So in the book, after hearing the dwarves' grumblings and complaints, Bilbo tells them that is fine and that he can put them back in their jail cells, and then perhaps they'll escape another time if he feels so inclined to help them again. It's one of those really sassy moments from Bilbo that I really love, and it convinces the dwarves to go along with the plan. Because obviously, the idea of going back to jail doesn't excite them. So they all head down to the cellar, where they begin to execute Bilbo's plan of escaping in the barrels. But of course, there are a few differences with this sequence, which might reveal why Tolkien fans hate this movie version so much. And it all boils down to one thing really: the book version is boring. I don't mean that in a bad way, but as you'll soon see, Tolkien is a lot more realistic and logical, even in his own fantastical world. So here are all the changes regarding this iconic scene from the films. First, after returning to the cellar, Bilbo replaces the keys back on the guard's belt, because he feels bad for causing the elf so much trouble. He thinks that if the keys are still on the guard, it'll save the elf some explanations to the king and he might not get punished, which I think is a nice touch. The next change is the fact that the dwarves don't just get into barrels that are empty. They actually get stuffed into barrels with other goods, and Bilbo goes to each dwarf, packing them in as snugly as possible. Again, Tolkien was realistic even inside of his own wild stories, and he wanted to make it clear that the safest thing for them to do would be to fit tight inside the barrel so they wouldn't bounce around. And on top of that, Bilbo goes through and puts lids on each barrel, sealing them off. There are air holes so they can still breathe, but the tops of the barrels are closed and sealed with each dwarf inside. Bilbo himself, similarly to the movie, is not in a barrel, and we'll see how he survives later on. Another key change here is the fact that in the book, Bilbo doesn't pull a lever, causing the barrels to fall into the water below. You might be surprised to find out that the elves themselves toss the barrels into the water. That's right, just like in the movie, there was a feast occurring in the palace, and the elves were eager to finish their work so they could go up and party. Like they did regularly, the elves needed to send off some empty barrels to Lake Town for trade, and the butler, who was drunk on the table, was usually in charge of this. At the proper time, some elves came down to the cellar after the dwarves had been stuffed in the barrels and found the butler drunk. They laughed at him about it, as elves in Tolkien's work are often jolly and lighthearted, and they woke the butler up. They told him that they needed to send these barrels off and that they feel they're heavier than they're supposed to be. But the butler insisted that he did his work right, and the barrels there all needed to be sent and not to question the weight. So the elves opened the trapdoor and one by one tossed the barrels into the water. Once they were all tossed below, the elves raised the portcullis and allowed the barrels to flow down the river. Which brings up another change, and that is the fact that the elves were completely unaware of the dwarves' escape. In the movie, they find out, which leads to this epic chase scene in the river, but in the book, the elves are none the wiser to Bilbo's schemes. And by the way, Bilbo grabs onto one of the last barrels and gets tossed into the water without the elves ever knowing, because he's been wearing his ring this whole time. But unlike the dwarves, he is not inside the barrel, he is on top trying to hold on for dear life. So at least that is accurate to the movie. Unfortunately, it's hard to track the changes after this because frankly, everything about the scene is incorrect. There are no orcs chasing them, the elves don't even know they escaped, and the dwarves are sealed up tight in the barrels so they can't be seen or even fight anyone anyway. I think what irritates people most about this sequence in the film is really just how unrealistic it is. Like I said earlier, Tolkien had a way of crafting a fantastical world full of unimaginable things like magic and different races, but he was incredibly realistic when it came to physics itself. A fat dwarf bouncing down a hillside and popping out with weapons to kill a bunch of orcs, or an elf jumping onto the heads of a couple of dwarves who are floating down rapids in barrels barrels is completely unrealistic. Similarly to how people get upset at Legolas's superhuman stunts in The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson did it again in The Hobbit. And on top of this being super unrealistic, it completely alters the story itself. As you've already seen, the book is drastically different. And on top of that, you've got the additional love story of Kili and Tauriel. I think the grievances kept adding up over time and just exploded out of fans during this scene. It's really the tipping point for a lot of people who were able to hang on until this moment. But after seeing the barrel scene, they just go, nope, I can't do it anymore. Now, because it's my duty, there are still a couple more changes that we need to address. Because as you might have noticed, we haven't finished the scenes for today. The next change is a quick one, and that is the fact that, obviously, the whole scene of Gandalf going to the Nazgul's tombs is made up. Next, though, we come to the dwarves encountering Bard on the shore. This never happens in the book. In fact, the dwarves stay in their barrels overnight. After getting to the end of the stream, there were some people whose job it was to look out for the shipment and to rope the barrels together and prepare them for the next day's journey to Lake Town. Bilbo couldn't very well free the dwarves right then and there as they were surrounded by people, so he left the dwarves inside of the barrels and went into the woods to survive until the next day. Although his sneezing gave him away a few times and he had to run despite being invisible. But eventually the next day came and the dwarves are freed. How they're freed is a story for next episode. But for now, just know that Bard is never introduced in this chapter, and men working on the barges are some random no-names for now. And finally, to wrap up this episode, we have yet another additional scene, which is when Thranduil is interrogating the orc. This subplot is made up, and Thranduil doesn't appear again until later in the book. Of course, Tauriel and Legolas shouldn't be here at all, but you already knew that. So, picking up from where we left off last episode, we see Bard the Bargeman guiding his boat through the waters as he smuggles the dwarves into Lake Town. As he enters, we meet Alfred, the wonderful assistant to the master of the town, and a worm-tongue copycat. He attempts to empty the barrels on Bard's boat, which have been filled with fish to cover up the dwarves inside. However, after some subtle threats from Bard, Alfred stops and allows him to continue into the town. Once Bard is inside, the dwarves get out of the barrels and they make their way to Bard's home. There's a brief chase scene with some guards, but that doesn't really matter. We also meet the master of Lake Town, who is absolutely disgusting. And amongst these Lake Town scenes, the movie cuts away to Tauriel and Legolas, who argue about their duties in the world and philosophical nonsense like that. But eventually we get back to the dwarves, who are unhappy with the arrangements Bard has made, as his weapons aren't suited to their needs. So after Bard goes out to find a random tapestry, Thorin and the dwarves sneak away to steal swords from the armory. Cause that sounds like a great idea, right? Steal from the town that's hosting you. Definitely won't lead to trouble. Well, I guess in their case it didn't, because they get caught and the master of Lake Town lets them off the hook. But not without a bit of a struggle, as Bard returns after figuring out who Thorin is, and he tells the people to not help the dwarves, as they'll bring death and destruction to the town. Of course, the Master and Alfred hate Bard, so they just go against what he says. Plus, the people are keen for a little gold, and Thorin promises them riches if they help. So after a night of feasting and celebrating, they get up the next morning and set out on a boat along with armor, weapons, and food stores to last the journey. Bofer, however, sleeps in and misses the boat, and Philly and Oin stay with Kili, who was poisoned from the arrow he was hit with in Mirkwood. Eventually, Bilbo and the remaining dwarves get to the mountain and begin their trek to find the hidden door. Somehow it seems that they make it there in a day, but that's besides the point. Amidst these scenes, we cut to Gandalf, who goes inside Dol Guldur and finds Thrain, Thorin's father, who has gone insane. Before we see the climax of Gandalf's adventure, though, the movie goes back to Thorin's company, who eventually find the door and wait for the last light to reveal the keyhole. But the keyhole doesn't come, and they all walk away dismayed. All except Bilbo, that is, as he stays and tries to figure the door out. Eventually, the moon comes out, and he sees the light of the moon that shows the keyhole. Thankfully, Thorin must have just walked 10 feet away and then hid behind a rock or something, because he happens to be right there during Bilbo's discovery. But anyway, the keyhole appears, and Thorin inserts the key Gandalf gave him, and the door opens. Then we watch about 10 minutes of camera panning around as Balin cries and the dwarves just stare there in awe. Eventually, Bilbo asks what the Arkenstone is, which is portrayed in a carving above the door, and Thorin replies that the stone is the reason why Bilbo came with them. And that is where scenes stop for today. Whew, that was a lot. And even that was a SparkNotes version of the full thing. Like I said, it's 45 minutes in the extended edition of the film, and 99% of it isn't even in the book. But anyway, before we get into the plot stuff, let's cover our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First up for characters, we have quite a few discrepancies. Obviously, there's Tauriel and Legolas, who are not found in the Hobbit book. Tauriel is of course made up entirely, and yes, I realize the irony of that statement given the fact that the entire book is made up. I've seen your comments. But anyway, besides those two elves, Gandalf and Radagast are also out of place here. Despite Gandalf having his own role in Tolkien's general lore during this timeline, the book doesn't cover it. And speaking of Gandalf's part in the movie, Thrain is also incorrect here, because he is actually dead. Like, dead. In fact, in Tolkien's lore, Gandalf had found Thrain in Dol Guldur more than 90 years prior to Thorin's journey to reclaim Erebor. But anyway, we also have the movie-only edition of Alfred, who is just a Walmart Wormtongue. And although Bard isn't a movie-only edition, he is quite changed for the film. As we'll see, his entire subplot is made up, and he doesn't appear in these two chapters that we're covering today. Plus, he isn't even a bargeman, but we'll talk about that in a future episode. Finally, for characters, the movie also removed the woodland elves who helped transport the barrels. You see, there were some elves who worked on the river and would transport the barrels by barge to the town on the lake. Then they feasted with the master, which we'll get into in the plot changes. But as you know, the movie doesn't show any sign of elves in Lake Town. Next, our timeline category is a bit simpler, as it only contains 2 changes. However, these 2 changes are quite large timeline differences. First, the dwarves stay in Lake Town for 2 weeks before leaving. After all, the town was pampering them like crazy, so I'm sure it felt good after an awful journey they had been through the Misty Mountains and then Mirkwood. The second change here is similar to the first. As the dwarves depart from Lake Town, it takes them 11 days to get to the hidden door, and 3 of those days are spent entirely on water. Like I said in the movie recap, it seems like they left Lake Town and then got to the hidden door in less than a day. I know that's probably not the case, but still, it just doesn't seem like 11 days. And on that note, our third category is location, and typically I reserve this for places that were omitted or added. Here, there aren't any of those because we really only have Lake Town and the mountain in both the book and movie. But what I will count as a difference is the sheer size of these locations and the distance they are from one another. As I just mentioned, it took them 11 days to travel from Lake Town to the hidden door, so I think it's a bit larger than the movie portrays. Plus, there is a difference in Lake Town's geography, as it was a lot closer to the shoreline than the movie shows, and there was a bridge that led from the shore into the town. In fact, as we'll soon see, the barge with the barrels is roped near the shore, and then Thorin's company walk the bridge to head into town from the shore, but we'll get there in a minute. Today we'll be going through chapters 10 and 11, and there are several things we'll be covering. These chapters are pretty short, which is why the movie version is so astonishing, as it expanded on things so much that it was forced to fabricate new plot lines to fill the dead air. And while we'll cover more than just Alfred and the Master today, I want you to keep your eyes and ears open and piece together the massive changes between these characters in the book and movie. Obviously, to start, Alfred is completely made up. But more specifically, look at the Master from these scenes, and Tolkien's version of this Middle-earth entrepreneur. But anyway, before we get to the Master, we need to address our first change, which is all about the way in which Thorin's company arrives in Lake Town. Because, surprise, they don't come with Bard. Like I mentioned earlier, Bard doesn't come into the story yet. So how did it get there? Well, the elves brought the barrels to Lake Town, and after arriving, they went on to their feast with the Master. The barge was then left on the shoreline under the not-so-watchful eyes of the guards, who didn't see Bilbo unpack 13 barrels filled with dwarves. It had been a while since they had any real trouble in that land, and therefore the guards were drinking and playing games when Fili, Kili, Bilbo, and Thorin walked from the shore to the town entrance on the bridge. And as you could expect, the guards were quite shocked at the sight of 3 dwarves and a halfling. Which brings us to the next change, and that is the addition of this crazy plot involving Bard and the Master of the Town with Alfred in his ear. There is no hatred between them. There is no spying, there is no Alfred, and thus the story in the book is a lot more straightforward. The dwarves are starving and they have no weapons, so why wander into the wild toward the mountain when there's a perfectly good town right there? That's why Thorin and the others walk directly up to the guards and introduce themselves. After the guards get over their shock, they escort Thorin to the Master of the Town as he requested, and Thorin interrupts their feasting to announce himself. Everyone at the feast is astonished, and they all get up out of their chairs, with the elves who are there shouting that the dwarves are vagabonds and prisoners who escaped from Mirkwood. But after the Master of Lake Town asks if this is true, Thorin replies that they were wrongly imprisoned and that he now speaks to the Master of the Lake, not to the elves of the wood. This shuts up the elves, who quickly ran off to inform the Elven King of this new development. Obviously, another difference we have here is the fact that the dwarves don't go to steal weapons from the town armory. As we just discussed, Thorin is quite upfront with the guards and asks personally to be taken to the Master of the Town. He even at one point tells the guards that they have no weapons and no need of weapons as they don't intend on fighting the people of the lake. I don't know about you, but the movie version really doesn't set them up for success. Obviously, it still works out for them, but in reality, if you were some dwarves in a town of men and you got caught robbing the town armory, you'd be thrown in jail immediately. But anyway, let's resume with this moment in the book between Thorin and the Master. Similarly to the movie, Thorin essentially asks the people of Lake Town if they are willing to share in the riches of Erebor, and the Master is put in a tough spot. The main change here is once again the addition of Bard, who tries to stop the dwarves in the movie. But in the book, there is no Bard, and this entire interaction with the Master literally takes up one page. On one hand, the Master doesn't want to upset the Elven King by helping out his former prisoners. But on the other hand, the people of Lake Town might riot if he denies the dwarves any assistance. So after some quick thinking, he decides to help Thorin, and the people rejoice as they sing about the king under the mountain and the vast riches that are inside. Like I said in the timeline section, they actually spend 2 weeks in the town, feasting and celebrating with the people. But as autumn draws to an end, they decide they must move on. Plus, they don't want to wait until the people of Lake Town change their mind. This decision to officially leave actually shocks the Master of the town, who didn't fully believe that Thorin was who he said he was. He thought they'd eventually be found out as fakes and then they could throw them in prison. But now he's confronted with the reality that these dwarves might actually go wake up the dragon. But he sends them off anyway with 3 boats and lots of supplies, as he's happy just to have them out of his hands. And that's essentially the last we hear of the Master in this part of the book. All the scenes with Alfred, made up. All the scenes showing how disgusting the Master is, made up. I think the movies made him unbearably repulsive for comedic effect, but I really don't see why they needed to do that. His role in the book is quite small, but in order to give Bard an antagonist in the movie, they turn the Master into a greedy, evil monster. Now moving past Lake Town, we come into chapter 11 and learn more about the dwarves' journey to the mountain and their discovery of the hidden door. Of course, the first change in this chapter is the fact that Kili isn't sick. He was never shot by an orc archer, and therefore he isn't poisoned. This also means that Fili, Oin, and Bofur don't stay back either. And as for Bofur, it's ridiculous to think that one of them would have slept through their departure. Even if they did, the idea that Thorin would just leave them behind instead of waking them is insane. But that's besides the point. The next change kind of piggybacks on this Kili sickness, and that is the fact that the Tauriel and Legolas scene is made up. Originally, I was going to talk more about this today, but I decided not to. After all, we'll have plenty of time to discuss Tauriel in the next episode. And speaking of moments which were added that I really won't talk about much today, we have Gandalf's scenes. As I mentioned in the timeline and character sections, Thrain died more than 90 years prior, so Gandalf finding him now just isn't possible. In addition, Gandalf doesn't go alone into Dol Guldur at this time. He and the entire White Council attack the fortress, driving Sauron away. But for more info about that, you can check out my video dedicated to Dol Guldur's complete timeline, which I'll link in the description. Now back to Bilbo and the dwarves, our next change brings us to the stairs to the hidden door. This might be a small change, but the stairs aren't carved into a giant statue of a dwarf. They're a lot simpler and more rustic than that. Although I think it was a pretty cool visual in the film, so out of all the changes today, I'm okay with this one. And finally, once they get to the door, their attempts to reveal it are much more earnest than the movie version. In the movie, it's like they're only there for a couple of minutes, and then the sun sets and they give up. But in reality, they find the door and probably spend hours banging on it to get it open. After the sun sets, they all sit around grumpy and make comments about how Bilbo should be figuring out how to get in. After all, he's their burglar, right? Never mind the fact that he's saved their lives multiple times so far and has proved his worth 10 times over. But eventually, Bilbo does indeed figure it out, no thanks to the dwarves, and he calls for Thorin as the moon comes up and the keyhole is revealed. The main difference here? Thorin and the others don't give up and walk away. That is totally ridiculous. You're telling me they travel for months, almost die about a dozen times, and then as soon as the sun sets, they're like, oh well, let's go home now. No way. In the book, they're sad that their door didn't open, and they're frustrated, no doubt, but they don't just leave. And Thorin dropping the key in the movie? He would never do that in the book. Even if he thought the door was useless, he'd still keep the key. After all, it might be the only thing he has from his father. But anyway, Bilbo figures out the door and he shouts for the others, who all come quickly scrambling over the rocks, and Thorin opens the door. And that is where our changes end for this week. I don't know about you, but those seem to go by pretty quick for this episode. Usually I feel like I have a million changes I need to address, and even more so if the scenes are 45 minutes long. But because those 45 minutes were filled with 97% fabricated plot lines, it made things pretty easy. As for Alfred and the Master, I get that it might be hard to explain my dislike for these characters just through this video. Because it's such a visceral thing, you really have to watch these scenes to get the idea, especially the extended edition. Just as an example for those of you who haven't seen the extended version, I'm gonna pop some images on screen of what I'm talking about. Yes, Tauriel is made up. Yes, the love between her and Killy is kind of cringy and strange, and more so because Tolkien never wrote about it. Is it unnecessary? Sure, but as for characters whose subplots are utterly pointless, adding nothing to the story, no value whatsoever, I rank Alfred and the Master way above Tauriel. At least she lasts through the final movie and plays a role in Killy's ultimate demise. The Master, though, he's literally on screen just so you can have a reason to root for Bard, who is also needlessly added. Their entire subplot doesn't matter, and it makes zero impact on Bilbo's journey. That's why Tolkien gives him only a couple of paragraphs in the book. But anyway, enough of my ranting. What do you think? Who do you think is more pointless, the Master and Alfred or Tauriel? Let me know in the comments. So, picking up from our last episode, the movie cuts to Killy nearly dying in Lake Town as Beaufort tries to find some Kingsfoil. The movie then jumps to Balin and to Bilbo as they walk down a tunnel toward the center of the mountain where Bilbo will try to find the Arkenstone. Balin tells him that he doesn't have to go, but Bilbo insists that he must hold up his end of the bargain. Then we cut to Gandalf, who faces off with Sauron and Dol Guldur and is ultimately defeated and captured. Then going back to Bilbo, we see him walking through piles of jewels and gold as he hunts for the Arkenstone. Eventually he wakes up Smaug and they have a pleasant conversation. Then we see Bard getting arrested and Thorin refusing to go in and help Bilbo, who is surely being eaten by a dragon. But behold, he is not. We see Bilbo running and hiding from Smaug, who is getting more and more unpleasant by the second, and eventually he puts on his ring and runs off. Back at Lake Town, orcs begin to attack the dwarves there, and Tauriel and Legolas show up to save the day. After chasing off the orcs, Legolas pursues them while Tauriel stays behind and heals Killy. Back at the mountain, Bilbo runs into Thorin, who is already falling under the dragon sickness, and isn't happy that Bilbo hasn't found the Arkenstone yet. But before Thorin can kill Bilbo, Smaug shows up and all the dwarves run away from him. We then see an elaborate chase scene in which the dwarves somehow escape death multiple times in the most ridiculous ways possible. And by the end, they make poor old Smaugy feel so bad that he leaves the mountain and flies to Lake Town. And that is where the movie ends. Anyway, let's get into our analysis by jumping into the first three categories of characters, timeline, and location, all of which are pretty simple this week. Out of these first three categories, our characters were changed the most. To start, Tauriel and Legolas obviously are not involved in this chapter, as neither of them appear anywhere in the book. Speaking of people who don't show up in this chapter, by the way, we have Bolg and the other orcs, as no one is hunting down Thorin's company in the novel. If you watched last episode, you know our next character difference is of course Alfred. The Master was in the book, but Alfred is nowhere to be found. And Bard himself is a little different, as he only shows up in the following chapters during and after the attack. We don't have a big backstory or underlying plot for him prior to the attack, and the Master doesn't trick him and arrest him. And lastly, for our character category, the movie messed up Gandalf, who is nowhere to be found in this chapter. And that segues perfectly into our timeline and location categories, which I'm going to combine this week as they have the same difference. The Dol Guldur subplot is completely incorrect in the film. I won't dive into the nitty-gritty details, but regarding timeline, Gandalf visited the fortress like 90 years before Thorin went on his journey to reclaim Erebor. And regarding location, obviously, Dol Guldur as a whole is not mentioned in this chapter, and therefore not in these scenes. If you'd like a way more detailed explanation of Dol Guldur's complete timeline, I made an entire video all about that, and I'll link it in the description. Obviously, I'm gonna try my best to cover everything in chronological order, but as you heard during the movie recap, they jump around quite a bit. But our first few changes today come right at the beginning and are quite obvious. First, Killy isn't injured, and therefore there aren't any dwarves still in Lake Town. When they left the town, they all left together, and they're all at the mountain when Bilbo finds the door and they enter it. Like I mentioned earlier, this is the point where a lot of previous fabrications are compounding and having an effect on these later moments. For example, no barrel scene equals no injury, and no injury equals no Killy and others still in Lake Town. Which brings me to the next change, and that is the addition of Tauriel and Legolas. If you're a regular viewer of this series, then you're probably sick of me mentioning it, but hey, it's my job. Anyway, when we look at what is real versus fake, Legolas is obviously a real character, and Tauriel is not. She was completely made up in order to create a romantic element in a story that is devoid of romance. As I talked about in the previous episode of this series, I can actually handle a lot of the Tauriel additions, and instead the person who really bothers me is Alfred. But we'll talk more about him in the next episode, as he is quite involved in the Battle of Five Armies movie. Finally, the third obvious change I want to get out of the way right here at the beginning is of course the fact that no orcs come hunting Thorin's company. That's right, there's no Lake Town fight sequence in which some absolutely incompetent orcs can't manage to even kill 4 unarmed dwarves and 3 children. I think stormtroopers would have had a better chance. In the book, orcs are briefly mentioned and only in regards to the Misty Mountains and then later during the Battle of 5 Armies. There's none in the in-between chapters here. And I didn't write it down, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'll throw in there the whole thing about Bard being arrested and his subplot as one major change. I know I mentioned it in the character category, but it is pretty much a plot change as well. But now with those 3 changes, plus that bonus one, out of the way, we can officially jump into Bilbo's plot and talk about what this chapter in the book is really about. Pretty much, we just read about Bilbo heading into the mountain and then having a conversation with Smaug. Then Smaug gets mad and goes to Lake Town. But wait, don't jump ahead just yet. I know even from that very brief summary, you've probably pieced together a few changes. But let's break this down one by one. First, let's look at the ring. In the book, the dwarves know about Bilbo's ring. He had revealed it to them after the spider incident in Mirkwood, and when he rescued them from the Elven King's palace, they all saw him put it to use. Or I guess they didn't see him put it to use. Anyway, that has a great effect on this event, because if you have a ring that turns you invisible, you're obviously going to use it to go snoop around a dragon's lair. And all of the dwarves encouraged him to use it for that purpose. In contrast, the movie decided to have Bilbo keep the ring a secret, and not even put it on until the very last second when Smaug wakes up. Now technically, out of everything in this adaptation, I think Tolkien would have approved of a change like this. Why? Well, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit way before the release of The Lord of the Rings. Therefore, a lot of these details, like the ring's significance, had not yet been fleshed out in Tolkien's mind. Originally, this was simply a magic invisibility ring and nothing more, so using it liberally made sense. But Tolkien later revised some parts of the original Hobbit text to fit the Lord of the Rings narrative. Anyway, all that is to say that I think Tolkien would have actually liked how Peter Jackson kept in line with the Lord of the Rings narrative from the start, with Bilbo being hesitant to share about the ring and taking it out every once in a while to stare at it like it's his precious. But what do you guys think? Was that a good decision to revise Tolkien's original text to help it better fit the larger ring narrative? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, let's move past that and head into our next change, which is that Thorin didn't instruct Bilbo to find the Arkenstone. In the movie, the Arkenstone is made the center of attention, and yes, it will come up in the book. But at this point, with Bilbo preparing to enter the mountain for the first time, he really isn't given any instruction. He simply has been hired as a burglar, and the dwarves see it as his responsibility to be the first one to have a look around, especially since he can turn invisible. But no, there is no outright instruction to find the Arkenstone. Not yet, at least. That being said, our next change is that Bilbo enters the mountain multiple times. The movie ironically condenses this into one visit, but in the book, Bilbo enters and steals a goblet from the treasure hoard. He brings it back up to the dwarves, who are ecstatic to see a remnant of their people's treasure. Unfortunately, dragons have a bit of a superpower. That superpower is the fact that they have an exact sense for all of their treasure. They know it front to back, piece by piece. So after Bilbo took the goblet, Smaug stirred and woke up in a rage as he noticed something was missing. This alerted Thorin's company to the dragon's presence as the mountain shook, and Bilbo encouraged them to run inside the tunnel for fear that Smaug would appear on the mountainside at any moment. Sure enough, no sooner had they all entered the secret door than Smaug had flown down upon their camp and chased off their ponies. And sadly, that would be the last time they would see those poor guys. Eventually, Smaug made his way back to the mountain, went inside, curled up, and went back to sleep in his massive pile of gold. But that brings us to the next change, which is the movie's removal of Bilbo's second time entering the mountain. Or I guess not really removal, but them condensing it into one visit. This second visit is more in line with what we see in the movie, and that is when Bilbo and Smaug finally speak to one another. The main difference is that the movie condensed these two visits into one, and the other part of this change is that Smaug wasn't really sleeping. That's right, knowing that the thief would return, Smaug faked being asleep, and as soon as he could smell Bilbo, he spoke out. And on that note, our next change is a smaller one, and that is the fact that Bilbo kept the ring on the whole time he was with Smaug. The movie, however, not only has Bilbo remove the ring, but it has Smaug sense something precious that Bilbo is carrying, and then Bilbo sees the Eye of Sauron as he takes the ring off. That never happens in the book, and as I mentioned earlier, The Lord of the Rings had not been written yet, so there was no deeper meaning behind the ring in this story. Now, as a quick aside, our next change takes us to Gandalf, and it's quite simply that these moments in Dol Guldur never happened in the book. And not only did they not happen in the book, but they don't happen at all in Tolkien's lore. Even if they did, Gandalf isn't mentioned anywhere in this chapter, and neither is the fortress of Dol Guldur. But now back to Bilbo, let's take a brief look at Smaug's conversation with the Hobbit. For the most part, the book and movie are quite similar in terms of dialogue, with a couple of key differences. Like I mentioned earlier, the dwarves don't send Bilbo in for the Arkenstone, and the Arkenstone isn't nearly as big a deal in this chapter as the movie makes it out to be. So this whole moment in the movie of Smaug saying that he's tempted to let Bilbo take the Arkenstone is made up. Another difference in this conversation is the fact that movie Smaug knows who Thorin Oakenshield is, just like pretty much every other character in this movie. But in the book, once again, things are way more realistic, and Smaug tells Bilbo that the line of the dwarves was broken and he has no enemies left alive. So it's completely unknown to him that Thorin Oakenshield has come to reclaim the mountain. In fact, yet another difference in the conversation is just how quickly Smaug blames the people of Laketown. He thinks that they are behind it. Bilbo's mistake was mentioning the barrels. As soon as Bilbo mentioned the barrels, Smaug's imagination went wild, thinking of how the men of Laketown were plotting against him. And this is ultimately what causes him to leave and go attack the town. And on that note, let's head into our next change here as Bilbo wraps up the conversation with Smaug. In the book, Bilbo does escape. He is not stopped by Thorin, although he does get a little hot on the backside as Smaug spits flames at him when he's running away. But he makes it safely to the outside and recounts the entire conversation to the dwarves. This moment of Thorin already being under the dragon sickness is a little quick on the movie's part. In the book, Thorin still has his wits about him and didn't suffer so quickly from this mental illness. But anyway, we only have a couple of changes left, with the penultimate difference being a small omission the movie made regarding a bird in the book. A bird, you ask? Yes, a bird. In fact, a thrush knocking on the mountain. After Bilbo escaped and spoke with the dwarves about his conversation with the dragon, they all sat outside and there was a thrush next to them that irritated Bilbo. He began yelling at it and telling the others that it gave him a bad feeling and that he thought it was listening to him. Thorin then confirmed his suspicions by saying that back in the day, their people could communicate with the birds and use them to deliver messages. Thorin then tells Bilbo to leave the bird alone as it very might well understand them and be an ally. The thrush eventually leaves them, but it will return later and we'll see that there's more to these birds than meets the eye, so tuck that away for a future episode. I won't cover it right now because we actually get into it in the next couple of chapters in the book. But finally, our last change for this chapter brings us to a decent portion of the movie. I think this takes up about 15 minutes or so, and that is the massive chase sequence in which Thorin's company run from Smaug and lead him into the Great Hall, where they trick him into nearly getting drowned by gold. This might be more ridiculous than the barrel scene. I think Bombur bouncing along the shoreline and Legolas jumping on the dwarves' heads is more realistic than the idea that these dwarves weren't burnt to a crisp the second Smaug saw them. The amount of times in these scenes that they stand behind a rock and somehow didn't get burnt is insane. The fire's like less than a foot away from them and somehow it doesn't hurt them at all. But oh well, it looks cool on film, I guess. And in the book, it's a lot more boring as Smaug just leaves after his conversation with Bilbo and he attacks Laketown. So they wanted a climactic moment for the second film. Who can blame them? In the book though, this also traps the dwarves in the mountain as Bilbo tells them they must go inside and close the secret door because Smaug will be outside any moment. And then for the second time, they head inside just in the nick of time as Smaug crashes down on their door before heading to Laketown, thus trapping Thorin's company inside of Erebor. As you can imagine, the movie picks up right where the last one left off as Smaug is heading to Laketown. Tauriel gathers the dwarves and Bard's kids and they get in a boat to sail to safety. Another person in the town trying to get to safety is the Master, who greedily piles gold onto a large boat and tries to sail away. But where is Bard? Well, if you remember from last episode, Bard got arrested and is in jail, but somehow as the dragon is spraying flames across the town, Bard ties together blankets to create a long rope and catches the master as he rows down the alleyways of the lake. How Bard created a rope that quickly is beyond me, but way to go, bud. After he is broken free from his cell, Bard gets a bow and some arrows and makes his way to the bell tower to try to take down the dragon. Bard's children see him firing arrows on the tower, and this causes the son, Bane, to run off and take the black arrow to his father, which he had hidden in the last movie. After getting the black arrow from his son, Bard creates a makeshift wind lance to fire the large arrow as Smaug charges toward him. And right as the dragon is charging, Bard sees the opening in his scales and fires the arrow right into him, killing the dragon. Smaug flies into the air one last time and then plummets into the lake, smashing the master and his boat in the process. Bilbo and the dwarves see the dragon fall and realize that Smaug has died, which causes Thorin to immediately begin walking toward the mountain entrance. After getting a quick glance at Gandalf in captivity, the movie cuts back to the people of Lake Town trying to collect themselves on the shoreline, and we see Tauriel and Kili have a moment before the dwarves hop in a boat and head towards the mountain. We also see Alfred being a nuisance, but thankfully Bard and Bane are still alive and stop Alfred from taking things too far. Alfred then jumps on the King Bard bandwagon, but Bard is adamant that they must first focus on tending to the wounded and finding shelter. And that is where our scenes end for this week. All in all, it's not that long of a sequence in the film, only about 18 minutes or so, which compared to my last few episodes is pretty short, as previously we were covering hour-long segments of the films. But as you'll soon see, there's a reason this opening is under 20 minutes, and that's because Peter Jackson pretty much cut out an entire chapter from the book, which we'll be covering in the plot changes. But first, let's get things started by heading into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. First up, we have our character differences, and it's pretty simple today, as there are only 3 added characters: Tauriel, Legolas, and Alfred. These characters don't show up in the Hobbit book, and Tauriel and Alfred are just completely made up in general. Also, Bard's kids did exist, but they're nowhere to be found in this chapter. I only know he had kids because Tolkien says that Bard was succeeded by his son Bane as King of Dale. Next, we have timeline, which has 3 key differences. First, the movie once again makes it seem like only a day's journey from Lake Town to the mountain, when in the book it is clearly multiple days away. So the idea that Kili and the other dwarves left Lake Town and went to the mountain in seemingly a few hours is just ridiculous. The second timeline issue we have is that in the book, the dwarves are in the mountain for about 2 days while Smaug goes to attack Lake Town. But in the movie, Bilbo and the dwarves watch the whole time as Smaug lights up the town, as if the entire attack was only a couple of hours or less. And finally, the last timeline discrepancy is the fact that in the book, the people of Lake Town stay on the shoreline for about a week before leaving to head toward the mountain. And they only left once the elves came to give them aid, but we'll talk about that more in the plot changes. Finally, before getting into the plot, we have location. First up, I have to mention once again that Dol Guldur isn't in the Hobbit book. Gandalf does go there with the White Council around the same time as Thorin's journey, but it doesn't line up perfectly, and he never gets captured, so the whole thing is wrong, really. If you want to learn the true story of Dol Guldur, I have an entire video on my channel dedicated to covering the complete timeline of that dark fortress and what Gandalf did there. Then our second location difference kind of goes hand in hand with our timeline change about the distance between the mountain and the town on the lake. It is way larger in the book than the movie shows. If you think we're going to start out our plot changes this week with Bard and Smaug's attack on Lake Town, you'd be wrong. However, I can't really blame you because that is how the Battle of the Five Armies movie starts. But that isn't how this section of the book begins, because before Tolkien ever tells us about the fate of Lake Town, we hear about Bilbo and the dwarves' time inside the mountain while Smaug is away. Which leads us to our first key change today that triggers a string of omissions, as nearly all of chapter 13 in the Hobbit book is cut from the film. And that first key change is the fact that Bilbo and the dwarves do not watch Smaug attack Lake Town. In fact, they don't even know that Smaug went to Lake Town. If you remember from last episode, the last thing we heard from Thorin's company was when Bilbo barely escaped Smaug in the mountain and ran back up to the dwarves with his backside nearly on fire. He then filled the dwarves in on his conversation with the dragon, and he begged them to get inside the mountain and shut the secret door, for he feared that Smaug would be leaving to hunt the mountainside at any moment. Well, Smaug did do that, and the dwarves reluctantly listened to Bilbo, just barely getting inside before Smaug smashed the side of the mountain, shutting them in for good. Then after this, Smaug flew to Lake Town as he wrongly assumed that the men of the lake were behind this giant plot, because of Bilbo's reference to barrels. So as you can see, the dwarves and Bilbo had no idea Smaug was going to do that, because they were too busy being huddled up inside the dark secret passage. So what does Thorin's company get up to while Smaug is away? Well, that brings us to our next few changes, which are all omitted moments from the book. First up, we read about Bilbo going into the mountain for a third time. Remember, in the book, he went the first time and stole a goblet, which woke up Smaug. Then the second time he went is when he spoke to the dragon. And now this is the third time, with Smaug being gone and Bilbo has free reign. Because they didn't know that Smaug went to Lake Town, they thought he might have returned to the mountain or be returning at any moment. So they had waited inside the dark secret passage for quite some time before Thorin got fed up and decided to move deeper in. Eventually, they got to where the passage opened up to a larger cavern, and Bilbo, who was at the front of the group, fell headlong into the hall. The dwarves all stopped at the bottom of the tunnel and fell silent as they were sure the noise would wake up Smaug again. But after a while of sitting in the dark, Bilbo couldn't take it anymore and shouted for them to get a light. Eventually, they did so, and after giving Bilbo a torch, they waited for him to investigate further. You see, since he was their burglar, they figured it was his responsibility to do the investigations. So Bilbo did just that and went further into the hall with his torch while the frightened dwarves hung back. Now this brings us to another important omitted moment and a key difference from the movie, and that is the discovery of the Arkenstone. In the movie, it is discovered upon Bilbo's first time into the mountain, and it's the key object he is sent to retrieve. In the book, however, it isn't such an important artifact at first. Of course, it is important, but in the book they don't even instruct Bilbo to find it. He just happens to come upon it while wandering through the Hall of Treasures. He immediately knows what it is, as the dwarves had told him about it before, but he picks it up for himself. It's an interesting moment in the book in which we have some internal dialogue that sounds very familiar to the effect the ring has on someone. Here's what we read. Suddenly, Bilbo's arm went towards it, drawn by its enchantment. His small hand would not close about it, for it was a large and heavy gem. But he lifted it, shut his eyes, and put it in his deepest pocket. Now I'm a burglar indeed, thought he, but I suppose I must tell the dwarves about it sometime. They did say I could pick and choose my own share, and I think I would choose this if they took all the rest. All the same, he had an uncomfortable feeling that the picking and choosing had not really been meant to include this marvelous gem, and that trouble would yet come of it. And as you know, trouble will indeed come of it by the end of the story. Now moving on to our next change, we head into the entire company's exploration through the mountain. You see, after a while of searching around, Bilbo ended up getting lost. When he was walking around, a large bat flew down over his head, which made Bilbo jump and drop his torch. It hit the ground and promptly went out, leaving him in the pitch-black dark. He began to yell for the dwarves, who were still scared in the secret passage, but Thorin and Balin eventually got the courage to lead the others to save Bilbo in the dark, saying that it was about time they did their part for the Hobbit. Once they found Bilbo in the dark, they all set about looking at the vast treasures, with Fili and Kili finding magic harps with silver strings, and Thorin finding valuable armor and jewels. And you know what else is found during this time? Bilbo's mithril vest. That's right, he gets it in this chapter before the battle ever begins, before Smaug is even defeated. And speaking of Smaug, we have one more part of this omitted chapter to cover before we head into his attack on Lake Town. And that final omission is Bilbo's reality check to the dwarves that Smaug is still out there and probably going to return soon. You see, the dwarves had been so mesmerized by the treasure that they nearly forgot about the dragon. But Bilbo, who was not as obsessed by treasures as the dwarves, sat down and began to feel hungry and worried. So he went up to Thorin and told him that they really should get a move on and form a plan. So Thorin did just that, as Bilbo had kind of become the unofficial leader of the group by this point. Thorin led the company through the mountain, and eventually they came to Thror's chamber and feasting area. From there, they went up to the front gate and finally got their first breath of fresh morning air in many hours, and felt the sunlight on their faces. Balin then led the group to a lookout, which was about a 5 hours march from the front gate. And by the way, that just goes to show you what I meant earlier when I talked about the location and timeline changes. It took a 5 hours march to head from the front gate to the lookout post. But at the end of the second film, we see Bilbo run from the front gate to a lookout area in a matter of seconds as Smaug flies to Lake Town. Then the company perfectly sees Lake Town from there. It's ridiculous. I mean, just think of how far away a 5 hours march would have been. So yeah, the sheer size of the mountain and the distance between Erebor, Dale, and Lake Town was massively underplayed in the films. But anyway, that wraps up chapter 13 as Thorin's company eventually make it to this lookout about 2 days after they last heard from Smaug. And in chapter 14, Tolkien rewinds the clock to fill the reader in on what happened all those hours ago when Smaug left to Lake Town. So let's head into the second half of today's changes and look at just how much the movie changed about Bard's encounter with the dragon. First up, we read that the dragon didn't find the people of Lake Town completely unprepared, because Bard knew what was coming. Remember, Bard in the book is drastically different from the first movie. In fact, this chapter is the first time we're hearing about him. In the book, he is the captain of the archers and well respected among the men of Lake Town. One night while the watchmen were out, they see golden light flashing from the mountain. The optimistic guards in the group think that the king under the mountain has truly returned and is forging gold once again. But one man in the group asks them which king under the mountain is it, the dwarf or the dragon? This man is of course Bard, and in his wisdom he knows that the dragon will soon come to them. So he starts shouting orders and goes to the master of the town to urge him to command the men to fight. And because of this, the people of Lake Town are actually a bit more prepared than the movie shows. Now because of this, we have a few changes I need to throw out there pretty quickly. First, to address the quick cut we get to Dol Guldur, Gandalf was never captured there. Second, all of the dwarves are at the mountain in the book. Killy does not have a love interest, he does not get shot by an arrow causing him to get sick, and therefore there aren't a few of the dwarves still in Lake Town. They are all up at the mountain. And third, as you can tell by what we just discussed regarding Bard, he was not put in jail. In fact, he was so well respected by the men of the town that I doubt they would have put him in jail even if the master commanded it. Which brings us to the next change, and that is the fact that Bard wasn't the only one trying to fight the dragon. The men loved Bard so much that they stood firm with him, firing arrows at the dragon over and over again. Eventually though, they did give up one by one, getting scared and jumping into the water. And yes, we do read about the master abandoning the town with his belongings, but Bard stands strong even after all of his men desert him or die. So what happens once Bard is the last one standing? Obviously, as we discussed earlier, Bard's children aren't in the book, and this is the first time we're ever hearing about Bard in general. So how does he have a black arrow, and how does he know about Smaug's weakness? Well, first of all, he doesn't actually know about Smaug's weak point until this very moment, and he learns about it in the strangest way possible, which never gets shown in the movie. A bird tells him. That's right, a thrush, probably the same one who Bilbo got angry at in our last episode, landed on Bard's shoulder and spoke to him right before he fired a black arrow. It told him to wait until he could see the opening under Smaug's left breast, and while Bard waited for his chance, the thrush told him about all of the tidings from the mountain. Then, seeing the hollow in Smaug's armor, Bard loosed his black arrow and killed the beast. Now that brings up an interesting detail that the movie changed, and that is the size of the arrow. Why do I mention this? Well, I'm obligated to talk about all the changes I find, but also I think this is kind of significant from a realism standpoint. I know, we're literally talking about dragons and birds that speak, but let's think about this. In the movie, the arrow is metal and about 4 feet long. When Bard fires it, it sticks into Smaug's chest, maybe 2 feet deep, if even that. In the book, though, the arrow is a regular-sized arrow that Bard fires from his great bow. He doesn't climb onto the bell tower and craft a makeshift windlance from his leftover bowstring and his son. First of all, that's impossible if you know anything about how bows are made. But second, in the book, we read that after Bard fires the arrow, it completely disappears into Smaug's chest, which makes way more sense than it only piercing about 1 or 2 feet deep into the beast. In the movie, I always watched it and thought, how in the world did that kill Smaug? That was like a pinprick to a beast of his size. But in the book, if the arrow went straight through him and pierced his vital organs, it would make sense that he would be killed by it. Anyway, what do you think of that moment? Am I crazy or am I onto something there? Now moving on, we have only a couple of changes left. First, the master does not die in the book, but rather he runs to the shoreline like a coward, and then when Bard survives, he plays politician. Not wanting to lose his rank to Bard's new popularity, as all of the people of the town are saying down with Moneybags and up with the archer, the master says that Bard can be king of Dale, but the men of Lake Town have always elected a master from the old and wise. Bard agrees with this and says that he will only stay with the people of Lake Town for now while they rebuild, but eventually he might go to Dale with those who are willing. By the way, this isn't from a completely selfless heart on Bard's part. We read that the master tries to stir up the people against the dwarves to divert their attention away from him, and Bard says that they're being fools as the dwarves are most likely dead. But after he says this, Bard realizes that if the dwarves are dead, then the mountain must be empty with all of that gold, and that Dale would be a fine location to rebuild and gain wealth. So that is why he promises to help the master rebuild, and then he will eventually go to Dale. In his mind, he'd be getting the better deal, as Dale is way larger and wealthier than the town on the lake. Oh, and I guess I'll throw a small change in here, which is that all these parts with Alfred don't exist because Alfred doesn't exist. But anyway, our final change is that after this conversation with the Master, Bard takes charge and sends messengers to the Elven King, asking for aid. Of course, the Elven King had already heard of the dragon's death, as he had sent his own agents among the people of the lake. But when he received word from Bard, he pitied the men of the town and decided to march to them with aid. And of course, it would serve his own purposes, as he believed Thorin to be dead and there to be a mountain full of gold waiting for them. Picking up from where we left off last week, we see a few of the dwarves who stayed back in Lake Town finally make their way into the mountain. Bilbo tries to stop them, saying that Thorin is going mad, but the dwarves continue inside and find their king walking around in piles of gold. We see all the dwarves happily reunite, and then they set out to find the Arkenstone among the mountain of gold. While the rest are searching, Bilbo goes off on his own and looks at the Arkenstone, as he has already found it, but is reluctant to give it to Thorin. We then see Bard and the people of Lake Town packing things up on the shoreline as they prepare for the journey to Dale. After briefly seeing Azog and his army of orcs, we cut back to the people of Lake Town as Legolas and Tauriel walk among them. Then, after refusing a summons from his father, Legolas takes Tauriel to Gundabad. The movie then cuts to Gandalf in Dol Guldur as an orc lion thingy takes him out of his cage and tries to cut his hand off. Thankfully, before he can, Galadriel steps in and saves the day. Then we see an epic fight sequence between the White Council and the Nazgul. Then Galadriel uses her power to banish Sauron from the fortress. Gandalf, who had been taken away by Radagast earlier on in the fight, comes to his senses and borrows a horse to ride to Erebor. Then the movie cuts back to Thorin, who is going crazy, and we see a few things like him giving Bilbo a mithril shirt, accusing his company of betraying him, and catching Bilbo with an acorn. Not exactly in that order, but you get the idea. We also see the people of Lake Town make it to Dale, and the next day the elves show up in the town to provide aid. Then Bard goes to speak with Thorin before Thranduil starts a war, but Thorin won't listen to him and tells Bard to leave, causing him to ride back to the Elven King, who is more than happy to let the dwarves die. And finally, we see Legolas and Tauriel at Gundabad before legions of bats and orcs are loosed to head toward Erebor. And that is where our scenes end for this week. So let's get things started by taking a look at our character, timeline, and location categories. First up for characters, we have the usual suspects: Legolas, Tauriel, Azog, and Alfred. None of these characters are found in the Hobbit book. Remember, Bolg is the head bad guy in the Hobbit book, not Azog. Azog is long dead by the time Thorin goes on his quest. On top of that, we're going to talk about a very special character named Roak once we get into the plot changes. As for timeline and location, there isn't much to be said other than what I've already mentioned in previous episodes. The distances between places in the movie causes issues for both of these categories. For example, Gundabad is hundreds of miles away. The idea that Legolas and Tauriel rode there and back that quickly is a little ridiculous. And the journey from the shore of the lake all the way up to the mountain is quite long, taking multiple days. Plus, the Elven King, aka Thranduil, rode with his armies to the people of Lake Town before they departed for Dale. So what we see in the movie of them showing up after Bard and his people had already gotten to Dale is incorrect. But we'll talk about that more in the plot changes. First up, let's talk about the dwarves who supposedly stayed behind in Lake Town. In the movie, we see Kili, Fili, Beaufort, and Oin finally make their way to the mountain after Smaug is dead. This happens, of course, only after Kili has been magically healed by Tauriel, but as you've probably guessed, this is a complete fabrication. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, this entire subplot is a house of cards. Kili was never injured by an arrow because there were no orcs chasing them on the river, Tauriel doesn't exist, and the dwarves' escape from Mirkwood was stealthy, not an action set piece. In the book, all 13 dwarves and Bilbo left Lake Town together, journeyed to the mountain together, and were all inside Erebor together when Smaug flew off to attack the town. Next, we see in the movie that entire sequence of the dwarves frantically searching the Gold Hoard for the Arkenstone while Thorin descends into madness. The movie makes this the only thing they are doing after Smaug's death. In the book, however, this entire event, the exploration of the treasure that is, happened way back in chapter 13, before they even knew Smaug was dead. While Smaug was away at Lake Town, the company went searching through their treasure hoard, and it wasn't just a desperate, paranoid hunt for the Arkenstone, it was a general, almost joyous exploration of their reclaimed treasure. They found all sorts of amazing things: coats of mail, weapons, golden stringed harps, which Philly and Killy found and played, and piles of gems. It's during this first exploration that Thorin gives Bilbo the mithril shirt as a moment of genuine friendship and reward. More importantly, Bilbo had already found the Arkenstone during that initial search. He found it by himself, drawn to it in the dark, and secretly pocketed it. He had a whole internal crisis about it that we discussed in the last episode, justifying it as his 1/14th share, but he never told the dwarves. The movie moves this entire event, strips it of its wonder, and ramps up Thorin's dragon sickness to an 11, making the Arkenstone his one and only obsession from the second the dragon is dead. But now, moving away from the mountain for a moment, we have the arrival of the elves. In the film, Bard and the survivors of Lake Town make the long, grim journey to the ruins of Dale. After they have already settled in and are starving, Thranduil and his elven army show up with carts of supplies, saying that they've come to help, but also with an eye on some white gems in the mountain. This is just slightly off from the book, and it flattens Thranduil's character. In the book, the Elven King was already on the march. News had reached him that the dragon was gone and the treasure of Erebor was unguarded, so he was marching with an army to claim a share for himself. However, after receiving messages from Lake Town about their troubles, his march of greed was then diverted to a mission of mercy, making his arrival not so much a surprise but an almost expected one on the part of Bard, who had sent the messengers to him. Also, as I mentioned in the plot changes, Thranduil arrived on the shores of the lake just 5 days after Smaug's death, bringing aid before anyone had left. They then helped the people of Lake Town, made plans with Bard, and then they all marched together towards the mountain as a combined force, arriving 11 days later. And while all of this is happening, where are Legolas and Tauriel? Well, in the movie, they're on a completely fabricated side quest to Gundabad, which is hundreds of miles away. They ride there, discover Azog has another army waiting, and apparently find some giant bats, and then, well, I guess they rode all the way back just in time for the battle. This entire subplot is, of course, 100% made up. It's just a clumsier way for the movie to create tension and explain the Second Orc Army, a plot point that the book handles far more elegantly and logically. In the book, Legolas is not present, and Tauriel doesn't exist. This entire diversion is just Peter Jackson padding out the runtime and trying to tie in a location that, while important to the lore, has no business being in this part of the story. Speaking of fabricated side plots, the movie gives us an epic scene where Galadriel, Elrond, and Saruman show up at Dol Guldur to rescue Gandalf. They fight off the Nazgul, and Galadriel goes full-on Dark Queen mode to banish Sauron. As cool as this scene is, it's not in the Hobbit book. As I covered in my full Dol Guldur timeline video, which the link for that is in the description by the way, Gandalf was never captured there in this way. In fact, he was never captured there, period. This entire sequence was Peter Jackson pulling from a few paragraphs in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, which describe the White Council's attack on Dol Guldur. But in the appendices, this attack is very anticlimactic, as there isn't an epic Nazgul fight. Plus, Gandalf was with the White Council at his full strength because he wasn't just imprisoned for a long time. By the way, in the Hobbit book, Gandalf simply leaves the dwarves at Mirkwood, goes off to attend to some other business, and then reappears near Erebor just before the battle, explaining that he'd been at a great council. The movie's decision to show Dol Guldur isn't a horrible one, as it did happen around the same time. I'm just sad that they changed so much of the lore to show it. They could have shown it, but followed what Tolkien wrote and still made a cool sequence. But now let's get back to the mountain. The movie gives us a few quiet, tense scenes with Thorin and Bilbo. In one of them, we see Thorin, who is already deep in his paranoia, give Bilbo the mithril shirt. In another, Bilbo has a worried conversation with Balin, where he heavily implies that he has the Arkenstone. In the book, both of these are wrong. Bilbo got the mithril vest way back in chapter 13 during the first exploration of the treasure that I mentioned earlier. Thorin gave it to him as a genuine reward for saving their lives multiple times already. It was a moment of true pre-dragon sickness warmth. And then secondly, Bilbo never hints to Balin or anyone that he has the stone. He is keeping it an absolute secret, planning to use it as his 1/14th share, and more importantly, as a potential bargaining chip to prevent a war. The movie also has Thorin confide in Bilbo, paranoid that one of the dwarves is a traitor. This is another invention, likely to build up their friendship and make Thorin's eventual rage and death a bigger emotional payoff later in the movie. And now this brings us to Bard's meeting with Thorin. In the movie, Bard rides up to the sealed gate alone and simply asks for a share to help his people rebuild. Thorin, in full-on dragon sickness, just yells at him to go away. The book is so much more dramatic and formal. First, Bard doesn't come alone. He approaches with a company of spearmen under the banners of the elves and of the lake, making it a formal diplomatic mission, not just one man asking for help. He then makes a formal, legalistic claim. He is Bard, the Dragon Slayer, and the direct heir of Girion, Lord of Dale, whose stolen wealth is in the mountain. Something that a lot of fans forget is that the city of Dale had a lot of gold on its own, and after Smaug captured the mountain, he moved a lot of the treasure from Dale into the mountain. So even beyond what Thorin would already owe the people of Laketown for their assistance, Bard, as the heir of the Lord of Dale, has a claim to some of the treasure inside of the mountain. And he does just that. Bard claims a share of the treasure on 3 counts. First, to rebuild Esgaroth, which was destroyed because of the dwarves' quest. Second, as a reward for killing the dragon. And third, as the rightful inheritance of his ancestors. Thorin, already deep in his sickness, refuses to parley with an armed host and tells Bard to leave. Later, though, messengers return and formally demand a 1/12 portion of the treasure. In response, Thorin, in a fit of rage, seizes a bow and fires an arrow at the lead messenger, which lodges in his shield. That is the act of aggression that starts the siege. It's then that the messenger delivers an epic parting line. "We will bear no weapons against you, but we leave you to your gold. You may eat that if you will." On one hand, I get that the movie wanted to avoid a legalistic diplomatic mission without emotion. Bard coming alone and talking to a dragon-sick Thorin is a lot more emotional and dramatic. However, I personally like that writing style of Tolkien and how he kept things as realistic and formal as possible, even within a fantasy world. But maybe that's just me. Let me know what you think in the comments. Finally, we come to the biggest change in this section, and the one that I mentioned at the start of this video. At the end of these scenes in the movie, Bilbo confronts Thorin, who refuses to help the people of Laketown. Thorin tells Bilbo once again to not underestimate dwarves, and that they won't be outnumbered for long. This makes no sense. How would he get word out? The movie erased the answer, and in doing so, removed one of the book's most important characters, Roak, son of Kark. And this key character is no dwarf, human, hobbit, or elf. He is a raven. In order to better understand this, though, we have to go back to the beginning of chapter 15, as Roak appears before Bard comes to parley with the dwarves. If you remember from the last episode, the dwarves went to a lookout while they waited to see what had come of Smaug, who had been gone for quite a while at that point. While waiting, Thorin notices a change in the clouds, and many types of birds returning to the mountain. Then the old thrush that Bilbo saw by the secret door many days prior returns. The bird then makes noises at them, seeming to try to get their attention. Bilbo says that he cannot understand, and Balin frustratingly says that he wishes that bird was a raven, for they used to speak to the ravens many years ago. Balin even mentions the name of Kark, the chief of the ravens that used to be in the area. At this mention of Kark, the thrush flies off and later returns with an ancient, massive, and speaking raven named Roak, who happens to be the son of Kark. So why is Roak so important to the story? Well, Roak is the one who delivers all the key news. He speaks ordinary language, and he tells Thorin, first, that Smaug is dead. This is the first official confirmation they get. Second, how he died. He pretty much explains everything that happened and the warrior from the lake who shot down the dragon. And third, he explains that an army of elves and men are marching on the mountain to claim a share of the treasure. But Roak doesn't just deliver news, he gives counsel. After all, he is 153 years old. He tells Thorin to trust Bard because he is a true man and to make peace, warning Thorin that the treasure is likely to be his death. But Thorin, in his paranoid, gold-sick rage, refuses. He thanks Roak for the news and pays homage to the alliance between his ancestors and Roak's, but then he requests that the Raven send his fastest messengers to his cousin Dane in the Iron Hills and tell him to hurry and prepare for battle. And that is how the dwarves really learn of Smaug's death, and it's how the dwarves get their backup. In the movie, however, this crucial character and plot point gets cut, creating a massive plot hole just so it could spend more time on fabricated scenes in Dol Guldur and Gundabad. I am a sucker for smaller characters that Tolkien adds throughout his stories. because in reality, they aren't all that small. Tolkien had no problem giving major plot points to characters that we only see for 1 or 2 pages, and in a film format, Hollywood says that method doesn't work. So in the movies, the focus stays on the main set of characters and tries to fill in all the gaps using just them. But personally, I wish Rohak would have been added. Maybe it would have seemed a little ridiculous to have a talking bird in there, but hey, we're literally dealing with a movie that has giant worms transporting legions of orcs to wage war on elves and dwarves. So I think a talking raven could have been in the realm of possibilities. But anyway, what do you think about this omission? Would you have liked to see this chapter be portrayed more faithfully on the screen? Or do you prefer that Rohak was removed for simplicity? Let me know in the comments. So, picking up from where we left off in the last episode, we see Bilbo leave the mountain to take the Arkenstone to Thranduil and Bard. He also reunites with Gandalf, who is trying to give counsel to the Elven King and the Dragon Slayer, but they won't listen. We then see the elves and the men come up to the mountain the next day and present the Arkenstone to Thorin, saying they'll give it to him in exchange for him holding up his end of their original bargain. Thorin gets angry at this, and after finding out that Bilbo gave the stone to them, he nearly throws the hobbit from the ramparts. Gandalf intervenes and stops him before he can, which allows Bilbo just enough time to scramble down from the gate and join forces of the elves and men. Unfortunately, Dain and the dwarves from the Iron Hills show up, which starts a fight. But before they can battle for too long, some massive worms burst through the earth and the goblins arrive. We then witness the dwarves and elves band together to fight their common enemy, and I won't go into the details, but we essentially see an hour-long battle sequence. During these scenes, we see Thorin overcome his dragon sickness and lead his company onto the battlefield, rallying the dwarves of the Iron Hills. Also, we see Bard protecting his people and children in the city of Dale, and Alfred dying a humiliating death. Then, to wrap it all up, Thorin and some of the others decide to confront Azog, who is on top of Raven Hill. Once they get there, they find that it's a trap, and Fili and Kili die, leaving Thorin to battle Azog alone. Thorin fights the final boss and ultimately loses, as although he defeats Azog, he dies in the process. Which personally, I blame physics for this one. I mean, how was Thorin supposed to know that Azog was a waterbender? Anyway, that wraps up our scenes that we're covering today, which most likely means that our next episode will be our last one. But as for today's episode, let's jump into our first 3 categories of characters, timeline, and location. These categories are pretty simple this week, as it's a lot of the same things I've been saying in almost every episode of the series. First of all, for characters, Legolas, Tauriel, Azog, and Alfred are all made up for the story. Obviously, Legolas and Azog are real Tolkien characters, but Azog was long dead by the time this story takes place. Bolg, who is shown in the movies, is Azog's offspring and is the main boss in this journey. Additionally, if you remember from last episode, we meet a raven named Rohak, who is the chieftain of an ancient race of ravens that help Thorin deliver messages to Dain. He comes back in these chapters, but in the movie we only see a raven, it doesn't speak, and we never learn its name, and the entire backstory of this relationship is omitted. As for timeline and location, we have the usual change that the scale of the mountain and the city are not as realistic in the movie. They weren't as close together, and it was quite a journey to walk from one to another. Obviously, for the sake of the movie, it was more convenient to show them right next to each other, just a quick jog back and forth, but it wasn't like that in the book. Plus, a little timeline issue is the fact that Dain doesn't show up until the day after Thorin rejects the offer from Bard. The dwarves from the Iron Hills do not show up as the elven army are outside the mountain, but we'll get more into that in the plot changes. I need to say up front that many of you warned me when I started the series that doing The Hobbit would probably drive me insane, but still I packed my things up, left the comfort of my Hobbit hole, and journeyed into the wilderness. Along the way, we have run into many foes and faced them all, but today our adventure comes to a head as we face our biggest foe yet, the Battle of the Five Armies. And I don't mean the movie, I mean the battle itself. It's important for me to tell you now that essentially everything that happens in this sequence is completely incorrect. That being said, I'm almost certain that I've missed some things. I usually try to point out all of the little details and differences, but because everything is so drastically screwed up, I probably forgot to add something here or there. But anyway, to make things easier, we're just going to follow Tolkien's order of events that he documents in chapters 16 and 17 of The Hobbit. Chapter 16, which is titled A Thief in the Night, is all about Bilbo delivering the Arkenstone to Bard, and the following chapter, titled The Clouds Burst, tells us about Dain's arrival and the little information we get about the battle itself. So starting with chapter 16, our first change here is the omission of Roach the Raven. And not just Roach, but the ravens as a race in general. You see, the chapter picks up by telling us that multiple days had passed, and during those days, Thorin and the dwarves were seeking the Arkenstone. Of course, Bilbo already has it, but they just don't know that yet. That is not the change, because of course that is in the movie, but what we don't get is when Roach returns from delivering news to Dain. He comes back to Thorin and tells him that Dain and about 500 dwarves should be about 2 days away now. Roach, who's over 100 years old and very wise, then tells Thorin that this will most likely end in death for all of them. He says that winter is not far away, and even if they win in battle, which they most likely won't, they'll probably starve without the aid of the elves and men. But Thorin, who is thoroughly in the grips of dragon sickness by this point, cannot see reason, and he is determined to fight his way out of this mess. After this, we return to Bilbo, who, after much thinking, has decided on a plan. He wants to give the Arkenstone to Bard. However, he first needs to get past the Night Watchman, which is our next change, as the movie gives this role to Bofur. For some reason, they turned Bofur into a key character in the movie, but in the book, it's actually Bombur. Bombur in the book has quite a few speaking parts, unlike the movie, and in this chapter, he is cold and tired and doesn't want to be on night watch. So Bilbo comes up and says that he'll cover his duty for the night, and then uses the opportunity to leave and head to Dale. And that brings up another change, as in the movie, we see Bilbo appear in Thranduil's tent that night, but in the book, he actually is caught by elven guards, although he kind of lets them catch him. Something that isn't super clear in The Lord of the Rings, as it is in The Hobbit, is the fact that even with the ring on, people can still hear you, and that's what happens to Bilbo. He accidentally falls into some water as he is heading to Dale, and hidden elves pop out at the sound, but they don't see anything. Bilbo, who is hiding behind a rock at this point with the ring on, sneezes. This sneeze is what gives him away, and he even hears the elven guards guess that it's probably the dwarves' servant who helped free them from the king's palace. Bilbo then willingly removes his ring and allows them to capture him. He then demands to be taken to Bard, and a couple of hours later he gets his wish. Next, this was actually a scene from the last episode, but it kind of has to do with these scenes as well, because we see Gandalf with Thranduil and Bard. Technically, Gandalf had not revealed himself yet to anyone, and was pretending to be an old man in the city. He didn't warn Bard or Thranduil about the goblins coming to attack them, and if he did, Bard and Thranduil would have taken him seriously. This is another thing that I'll touch on later, but the movies really made Thranduil seem like a jerk, when in reality, he definitely would have listened to Gandalf. Thranduil may have been proud, but he wasn't an idiot. For example, another change we have here is a small one, but goes to show Thranduil's kindness, and that is the fact that after Bilbo hands over the Arkenstone, he says that he is going to return to the dwarves. Thranduil can see that this is dangerous and unwise, and offers for Bilbo to stay. He says that Bilbo is more worthy than many elf princes to wear the elven armor that he has on, meaning his mithril, and he says that they'll take good care of him if he decides to stay. But Bilbo, being loyal to Thorin, says that he must return. I think they kind of gave this to Gandalf in the movie in order to maintain Thranduil's snooty attitude, but in the book, Gandalf simply reunites with Bilbo as the Hobbit is leaving and heads back to the mountain. He is an old man and reveals himself and says that something is coming that nobody knows about, and that's that. Also, technically Bilbo gives the Arkenstone to Bard specifically, as that is who he trusts the most. Plus, it was with Bard and his people that they made a deal. They never made a deal with the elves. And the last change for this little meeting in the night is the fact that the movie omitted Bilbo's key piece of information that he shares with Bard and Thranduil. You see, Bard is the one who's more willing to let the dwarves starve. He is much colder in the book. But Bilbo tells them that Dain is coming with about 500 dwarves. That piece of information, plus the Arkenstone, is what prompts Bard to go and try to make a deal with Thorin. So after this meeting and seeing Gandalf and Dale, Bilbo is escorted back to the mountain, where he sneaks back in without any of the dwarves knowing what he did. And that is where chapter 16 ends. But believe it or not, that only accounts for about 25% of our changes this week, because chapter 17 is where Peter Jackson had most of his issues. To start, there isn't a whole army outside the mountain as Bard and Thranduil present the Arkenstone to Thorin. In the book, a messenger comes and requests a parley with the dwarves. Thorin agrees, but says that they need to come few in number and unarmed. So later, Thranduil and Bard show up with only about 20 people, and they lay down their weapons before coming to the gate. Then, much of what we see in the movie here in this meeting is similar to the book. The Arkenstone is revealed, Thorin gets angry with Bilbo, and Gandalf reveals himself and Bilbo escapes. But our next change is something the movie didn't do, which is have Thorin agree to their terms. He tells them that they were right to think he would bargain for the Arkenstone because it is that precious to him. So he says that he will fulfill Bilbo's contract and give 1/14 of the treasure to them in exchange for the Arkenstone. Bard then says that they have until noon the next day to present the treasure, and then the stone will be theirs. Now, a little side note here is that Thorin agreed to this deal, but in his own mind, he was already thinking about ways that he could get out of it. He thought that maybe when Dain arrived, they could take the Arkenstone by force. So this promise wasn't 100% truthful. And speaking of Dain, that brings us to our next change, which is all about his arrival and the start of the battle. No, Dain doesn't arrive during the meeting. Like we already mentioned, the whole elven army wasn't outside the mountain anyway, so it wasn't as climactic as the movie shows. In typical Tolkien style, it was much more realistic per usual war customs. The day after the meeting, Dain and his people arrived, as they had marched through the night to get there faster. They sent messengers to speak to the Elven King and Bard, and essentially they say to get out of the way or else. And upon Bard and Thranduil's refusal, the dwarves prepare to attack. Now this brings me to a change regarding Thranduil that I teased earlier, and that is the fact that Thranduil is a lot nicer in the book. He does not have some strange vendetta against the dwarves. If anyone is harsh, it's Bard, who is way more willing to fight. Remember, he was the captain of the guard in Lake Town, not some peaceful bargeman. Thranduil, though, in Tolkien's typical elvish style, doesn't like death. This is what we read after Dain's messengers leave the presence of Bard and the Elven King. "Fools," laughed Bard, "to come thus beneath the mountain's arms. They do not understand war above ground, whatever they may know of battles in the mines. There are many of our archers and spearmen now hidden in the rocks upon their right flank. Dwarf mail may be good, but they will soon be hard put to it. Let us set on them now from both sides before they are fully rested." But the Elven King said, "Long will I tarry ere I begin this war for gold. The dwarves cannot pass us unless we will, or do anything that we cannot mark. Let us hope still for something that will bring reconciliation. Our advantage in numbers will be enough if in the end it must come to unhappy blows." So as you can see, this is literally polar opposites to the movie characters. In fact, in an earlier scene when Bard tries to speak to Thorin, he stops Thranduil from just going and attacking right then and there. And then when he returns, he is super unhappy that Thorin won't listen, and he seems to despise the idea of war. Whereas Thranduil has a look in his eyes as if he relishes the opportunity to kill the dwarves. The movie version of these two characters is just weirdly out of place. It is not in the peaceful nature of the elves to be this violent. As you can see by what Thranduil says in the book, the last thing he wants is blood to be shed over gold. But anyway, moving on to the fight itself, we read about the battle commencing as eventually it does come to unhappy blows, with the dwarves making the first move. The dwarves and the elves are just about to collide when Gandalf jumps in the middle of the battlefield and shouts for them to stop. Right at that moment, they can see a dark cloud quickly coming towards them, and Gandalf points out that it is Bolg and a goblin army, coming with bats in the sky. Plus, the wargs have teamed up with the goblins. Thus, we get our 5 armies: elves, men, dwarves, goblins, and wargs. For some reason, Tolkien doesn't acknowledge the bats as their own army, so maybe they aren't sentient like the wargs are. Anyway, with Gandalf's prompting and a new common enemy, the dwarves, elves, and men all team up against this new foe, and the battle begins. With that, let's do a quick lightning round of additions Peter Jackson made for the movie. First, there are no giant dune worms. Second, there's no subplot of Bard and his kids in Dale. Third, there's no subplot of Alfred dying a humiliating death. Fourth, there's no subplot of Tauriel and Legolas fighting Bolg. And fifth, there's no subplot of Thorin fighting Azog. Azog isn't in the story, and Thorin dies a normal death in battle, killed by regular goblins. Now let's slow it down slightly and talk about what we do read. We do get some description of the battle as the goblins started to overtake the allied forces. We read that the elves attacked first, but then they were supported by the dwarves soon after. We learn about goblins trying to scale the mountain. We also read that Bilbo put his ring on quite early in the fight and disappeared. Although it didn't protect him from being physically harmed, it did mean that he couldn't be specifically targeted by a goblin. The day drew on and the battle raged for hours, and eventually Thorin and his company emerged from the mountain. We never learn about what happened inside the mountain, but I'll just assume that something similar to what the movie shows took place, with Thorin finally coming to his senses and joining the battle. Bilbo witnessed the battle go on and on for quite some time, as he stood on Raven Hill where he had a good vantage point with some other elves. Raven Hill was also the best place to escape should one need to, but he was still invisible and the goblins had begun to throw rocks down from the mountainside. Thankfully, right as the battle looked like the men, elves, and dwarves had lost, Bilbo looked in the distance and saw what was unmistakably an eagle. That's when he shouted, "The eagles, the eagles!" But before he could see them arrive, a rock hit his head and knocked him out cold. Technically, I do want to mention that the movie incorporated a version of this as Bolg knocks Bilbo out after he arrives with reinforcements. But before being knocked out in the movie, Bilbo is quite involved in the battle, even killing some goblins and delivering news to Thorin and the rest of them. And that is the main thing that's incorrect. In the book, Bilbo does nothing other than just watch, and then he gets knocked out and misses most of the battle. Despite Bilbo being knocked out, we learn in the next chapter about the remainder of the fight as some people fill in the gaps for him. I'm not going to talk about the next chapter just yet, as we'll cover that in our final episode, but I will use some of the parts of that chapter to help us finish up with what we know of the Battle of the Five Armies. For starters, the eagles didn't fly Beorn to the battlefield like the movie shows, but Beorn did arrive and he was the one who saved the day, which is our next change, as in the book, Beorn is the one who kills the leader of the goblins, Bolg. Of course, I can see things from a movie perspective. Why would you give the climactic resolution of the battle to Beorn when you could have Thorin himself do it in his dying moments? After all, Thorin is pretty much the main character, and Beorn is just a supporting act. But as I've discussed on this channel before, Tolkien often gave really crucial moments to side characters who only appear for a few pages. It's a lot more realistic because if you really think about it in real life, it's not like one person gets all the glory. It's usually spread out across multiple people. But that doesn't do well on film because you really want the focus to be on the main characters. Tolkien, however, didn't care about that, and he used any characters he wanted for any purpose at all. And in this instance, it was Beorn who finished off the leader. But anyway, next, with Bolg dead, the goblins fled and the men, elves, and dwarves chased them down in the valley and killed them all. Also, just on a general note for the battle, there were no crazy war machines or different types of trolls. That was such an insane addition for the movie, to not only have trolls there, but to have different types of trolls. You had the ram troll, the catapult troll, the regular grunt troll, the blind paraplegic troll, and much more. Not only is this ridiculous in general, but also, how did this blind troll find its way up onto Raven's Hill? Plus, I get that it was a slightly cloudy day, but don't trolls turn to stone in the sun? Seemed like quite the plot hole to have the enemy's greatest weapons be a race that literally can't fight during the daytime, which is probably why in Tolkien's version, they weren't there. Also, not to nitpick, but if you have massive worms that can eat through stone like butter, why not have them attack? They literally make a path for Azog and his army, and then they just dip. They could have cleaned up the free peoples in seconds. Anyway, I gotta stop myself before I go off on too long of a tangent there. Our next change is the fact that Fili and Kili died defending Thorin. Azog isn't in the story, and Bolg isn't trying to wipe out the line of Durin. There isn't a specific plan formulated just to kill Thorin and his family. They're simply overpowered by many goblins, and the two younger dwarves lay down their lives to shield their king and uncle. And now to wrap things up, our last change is that after Bilbo wakes up, he is found by a random soldier who is sent to look for him by Gandalf. Thankfully, Gandalf knew of Bilbo's ring and made them look very thoroughly, as it was possible for him to be invisible. Then, after getting back down to base camp, Thorin requests to see Bilbo and they make their peace with each other as Thorin takes his last breaths. This is similar to the movie, except for the fact that they're not alone in the book, and Thorin is not dying because of Azog. He's dying because he just got stabbed a bunch. So let's recap what happened in these final scenes of the movie, that way it's fresh in our mind for the analysis. Picking up from where we left off last week, we cut away from Bilbo and Thorin to see Thranduil talking to his son Legolas and telling him to go find a man named Strider. Then the Elven King sees Tariel holding Kili, and he tells her that her love was real. Then we see Gandalf and Bilbo sitting down on Raven Hill, and the dwarves of Thorin's company gathering around Thorin's body. The movie then shows the funeral of Fili, Kili, and Thorin, and afterwards Bilbo says his goodbyes and leaves. We then get a very brief traveling montage of Gandalf and Bilbo riding on the countryside, and then Gandalf leaves Bilbo to finish the last stage of his journey alone. Bilbo then arrives home to see people auctioning off his items and his home, and he quickly puts a stop to it. The auctioneer asks for some sort of verification that he is indeed Bilbo Baggins, and Bilbo pulls out his contract with Thorin's company. After the auctioneer asks who Thorin Oakenshield is, Bilbo says that he was my friend. And finally, after getting a brief transition scene of Bilbo looking at the ring, we fast forward to the future when Gandalf arrives at Bag End for Bilbo's 111th birthday party. And that is where the movie ends. Now, to start things off this week, we're going to look at the character, timeline, and location changes first, but our plot changes will be a little unique. Since essentially the movie changed everything about the plot for these last couple of chapters, I'm simply going to go through what Tolkien wrote and share with you the true ending that some of you might have never heard. But first, we of course need to address our character, timeline, and location changes. Starting with our characters, we of course have the additions of Legolas and Tauriel, which I've addressed pretty much in every episode, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now. Other than those additions, we actually have a couple of small omissions in these final moments. First and foremost is Beorn. In the movie, Beorn just kind of vanishes after the battle, but in the book he is a central part of the return journey. He travels with Bilbo and Gandalf all the way back to his home and hosts them for several weeks. Secondly, Elrond and the Elves of Rivendell are completely missing from the return journey, which bleeds right into our timeline changes as the movie makes the journey home feel like a quick weekend trip. 1 minute they're at Erebor and the next they're at the Shire border. But in reality, months of time are skipped over. They leave the mountain before winter, stay at Beorn's through the cold months, and don't get back to Bag End until the summer. So yeah, the movie timeline is heavily condensed. And finally, for location, because of those return journey cuts, we miss out on 3 key spots for a return trip. We don't see Beorn's house, we don't see the journey around the north of Mirkwood, and we don't see Rivendell. It's a straight shot from point A to point B in Peter Jackson's version. Now, before we get to the true ending of Bilbo's journey, I want to give a huge shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, Robo Steve, and the rest of my incredible Patreon and YouTube members who have supported the series from episode 1. Also, special shout out to our newest members, Soul and Brian. By the way, if you're sad that this series is coming to an end and want to relive the story for yourself, I highly recommend grabbing the audiobook on Audible. Listening to the songs and the descriptions of the journey home is a vibe that the movies just couldn't capture. I have a link in the description that gets you 1 audiobook for free, so go ahead and claim your free trial today. It supports the channel and lets you dive deeper into Middle-earth. Now, with that being said, let's dive into the final category of plot. As I mentioned in the intro, the movie's ending is vastly different from the book. So instead of going scene by scene, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happens in the final 2 chapters of the book, which are the return journey and the last stage, just so you can see how much richer Tolkien's ending really is. Perhaps not as dramatic, but it definitely ties up the loose ends. To start things off, we pick up partway through chapter 18, as the beginning of the chapter details the ending of the Battle of the Five Armies, which we already talked about in the last episode. After we learn about how this battle ends and Bilbo reunites with Thorin on his deathbed, we read about Thorin's funeral. This is something we see in the movie a little, but without some of the context. For example, we read in the book that Bard returned the Arkenstone to Thorin by setting it on his chest and declaring that it shall stay there until the mountain falls. Then the Elven King laid Orcrist next to Thorin. If you remember in the book, Thorin got Orcrist from the Troll Horde way early on in their adventure, but it was confiscated from him back when they got captured in Mirkwood. In the movie, they show him getting it back when Legolas saves his life in the most unrealistic way possible, but in the book, it's a little bit more logical, per usual. We read that legend says the mountain could never be taken by surprise again, as the sword glowed brightly if orcs were ever near, which is a pretty cool bit of lore. Following the funeral, we learn about the new political landscape of the mountain. With Thorin gone, his cousin Dane Ironfoot took up the mantle and became king under the mountain. It's a bittersweet ascension though, because we learn that Fili and Kili fell defending Thorin, shielding their uncle with their own bodies. The remaining 10 companions stay with Dane, who proved to be a wise ruler. He honored the agreement Thorin made on his deathbed and gave Bard a 14th share of the treasure to rebuild Dale. Remember, in the book, Thorin had agreed to trade Bilbo's 14th share of the treasure for the Arkenstone, so that is the promise that Dane is fulfilling. As for Bard, we learn just how honorable he is, as he sends much of that gold to the Master of Laketown, and even returns the Emeralds of Gerion to the Elven King. It really ties up the loose ends regarding the treasure in a satisfying way that the movie glossed over. And just wait, we'll hear more about Bard and the Master of Laketown later on. Moving on though, we have the matter of Bilbo's reward. In the movie, Bilbo leaves with just a small bag and a couple treasure chests, and is treated as a quick goodbye. But in the book, Bard actually offers him a magnificent amount of wealth. He declares that Bilbo should be rewarded most of all, but Bilbo, ever the practical hobbit, declines the full share. He frankly tells them that he has no idea how he would get that much gold back home without war and murder. So just like the movie, he only accepts 2 small chests, one filled with silver and one with gold, just enough for one strong pony to carry. It's a humble choice that really defines Bilbo's character. Now that I think about it and I'm picturing it in my head, I believe a change in the movie is that he only takes 1 chest as he walks back to the Shire and isn't on a pony. But in the book, he has a pony, so he's able to take the 2 chests, plus a little bit extra that we'll learn about later on. Anyway, after the emotional goodbyes, Bilbo rides away with Gandalf and Beorn. In the movie, Beorn is basically an extra in the final battle, but here he becomes a travel companion. They travel with the Elven King's host for a while until they reach the border of Mirkwood. Here, in a moment totally absent from the film, Bilbo gives a necklace of silver and pearls to the Elven King as a thank you for his hospitality. He cheekily notes that a burglar has his feelings and he had drunk a lot of the king's wine and eaten his bread while invisible in his halls. Don't forget that they were trapped in Mirkwood for weeks, and the whole time Bilbo had to survive. So while he was trapped in Mirkwood, he quite literally was a burglar, running around invisible and stealing food from the Elven King's halls. The king is moved by this gesture and names Bilbo an elf friend and blessed. From there, the party avoids Mirkwood entirely, traveling around the north edge of the forest until they arrive at Beorn's house. And they don't just stop for a quick lunch like they did in the second movie. They stay there for the entire winter. They celebrate a warm and merry Yuletide with Beorn, enjoying the peace that has finally come to the region. It's a stark contrast to the movie where they seem to rush home. It's only when spring arrives that Bilbo and Gandalf finally take their leave. As they go through the high pass where they were captured by goblins so long ago, Bilbo looks back and says, "So comes snow after fire, and even dragons have their ending." A poetic way to close the chapter on his adventures in the wild. And this leads us into the final chapter, which is called The Last Stage. On May the 1st, Bilbo and Gandalf return to Rivendell, the last homely house. They are greeted with song by elves, and this is where we get a crucial bit of lore that explains Gandalf's absence. Gandalf tells Elrond the tale of their adventures, and Bilbo overhears that Gandalf had been at a great council of white wizards. They had finally succeeded in driving the necromancer from his dark hold in the south of Mirkwood. And this explains to Bilbo why Gandalf had to leave Thorin's company at the edge of Mirkwood so many months ago. After resting for about a week, they say farewell to Elrond and head home. On the way, Bilbo remembers the spot where the 3 trolls, Tom, Bert, and Bill, had turned to stone. Now I know it's been a while, but do you remember that some of the dwarves actually buried treasure from the troll horde? Well, Bilbo hadn't forgotten, and upon arriving at this location, he and Gandalf dug up the chest. They find it untouched and split the share, filling new bags on their ponies. It's a nice full circle moment, reclaiming the treasure from their very first adventure. It's also funny to me that Gandalf took some of the gold because you wouldn't think that he'd need the treasure. But Bilbo refuses to take the whole amount and says that Gandalf can probably find a better use for it, hence why they split it. And Gandalf replies, "Indeed I can, share and share alike." This makes me happy as I imagine Gandalf just traveling to different towns and handing out gold to those in need. Anyway, this brings us to the final leg of the journey, and a moment that differs slightly from the film. In the movie, Gandalf says goodbye to Bilbo at the borders of the Shire, warning him about magic rings. But in the book, Gandalf actually rides with him all the way back to Bag End. They crest a rise and Bilbo sees his hill in the distance, stopping to recite a poem about roads going ever on. It's a quiet moment that shows just how ready he is to be home. Now the movie shows this, but it only briefly addresses the main antagonists, the Sackville Bagginses. In the book, they are busy measuring Bilbo's rooms, hoping to move in. Bilbo's return causes a massive legal disturbance that lasts for years as he has to convince people who he is and actually buy back his own furniture from his neighbors. And sadly, he loses his reputation. He is no longer considered respectable by the hobbits, who think he's now queer and mutter about tunnels stuffed with treasure. But Bilbo doesn't mind. He hangs his sword, Sting, over the mantelpiece and is quite content using his magic ring to hide from unpleasant callers. The book ends not with a cliffhanger or a setup for The Lord of the Rings, but with a quiet visit years later. One evening, there's a ring at the door, and it's Gandalf and Balin. Balin has a magnificent jeweled belt and a long white beard. They sit by the fire, and Balin shares news of the East. He tells Bilbo that Dale is rebuilt and rich, Lake Town is prosperous, and there is a great friendship between elves, dwarves, and men. It's a confirmation that their struggle and the entire journey was worth it. We also learn of the fate of the old master of Lake Town. He caught dragon sickness after Bard sent him some of the treasure, and he fled with the gold that Bard gave him, and died of starvation in the waste, deserted by his companions. A tragic but fitting end for a greedy man. And finally, the book closes with a beautiful exchange. Gandalf tells Bilbo that he shouldn't think all his adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck for his sole benefit. He implies that Bilbo was just a small piece in a much larger story that was meant to happen. Bilbo laughs at this, hands him the tobacco jar, and says, "Thank goodness." And that, my friends, is how The Hobbit truly ends. It's a story about a small person finding their place in a big world, and coming home changed for the better. So what do you think? Do you prefer the movie's dramatic conclusion that tugs on your heartstrings, or would you have preferred the slow, comforting journey that ties up loose ends? Let me know in the comments below. It has been an absolute honor to go on this journey with you all through Middle-earth. Analyzing these movies has been a labor of love, and despite it being much more difficult than doing The Lord of the Rings, I still enjoyed it. Although, much like Bilbo, I am happy that this journey is over, and I can now sit back in my chair and relax for a bit. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the full playlist to binge the entire series from start to finish. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.